This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Welcome to today's meeting of the Planning and Regeneration Committee. Thank you for joining us today as we investigate the potential of mid-rise residential development in addressing London's housing needs. We'll examine how the next London plan could support this type of development and assess how mid-rise design and delivery align with London's broader housing, planning and design objectives. I would like to remind everyone to please switch their mobile phones to silent mode. I also ask that members and guests position their electronic devices away from their microphones. Please also adjust your microphones so you can be heard clearly, and remember to lift them from the base if needed. Members of the public are encouraged to follow @London Assembly on various social media platforms. When using X, please include the hashtag #AssemblyPlanning for this meeting. Before we begin, we have a few items of business to attend to. Can I now ask our committee clerk, Sal Fazal, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. No apologies for absence have been received.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendation set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interests to declare? Can I ask the committee to confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 8th of September 2025 to be signed by me as a correct record? Can I ask the committee to note the ongoing and completed actions arising from its previous meetings? Can I ask the committee to note the report? Can I also ask the committee to delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output in response to the proposed legislative changes regarding the planning powers of the Old Oak and Park Royal Development Corporation? Agreed. Assemblymember Garbutt.
Thanks, Chair. I just wanted to express a slight concern about one of the powers around temporary stop notices and just seek a bit more clarity outside the meeting before we sign this off.
Noted. Thank you. We now move on to our main item of business, a discussion on the role that mid-rise development could play in meeting London's housing needs and how the London plan could support it. We structured our meeting into 2 panels, and I would like to welcome our guests in the first panel to the Chamber. In the Chamber, we have Nicholas Boyce-Smith, MBE, founder and director, Create Streets. Welcome. Russell Curtis, founding director, RTKA and chair of the Barnet Quality Review Panel. And Maurice Lang, analyst at Centre for Cities. Thank you all for joining us. Before we get started, I would like to extend a warm welcome to students from Long Island University in the United States who are in the public gallery to observe today's proceedings. I hope that you find the discussion interesting and useful, and it's great to have you here. So we'll now move on to the questions. I will ask the first question, and the question is, should London build more mid-rise housing? Can it deliver the number of homes required to meet London's housing targets? I think maybe we'll start with Nicholas and then go across, if that's okay.
I failed at the first test and didn't press the button. So yes, short answer. It's easy really. The key point is this, is that there are advantages to low density and there are advantages to high density. And the point of mid-rise, or what I often call gentle density, is it's a pretty good way for many people, much of the time, I'm qualifying that, to allow them to live in households where they have control over their own immediate environment, but also to live in a neighbourhood where you get, which are dense enough to have, the shop down the road, pub around the corner, walkable to tube or metro or bus or whatever it might be. So the concept of mid-rise, though it's not right for everyone all the time, is a very good way of meeting the different tensions in how we want to live and how we build sustainably and also get the prosperity and the agglomeration effects of towns and cities. And I'll say one more thing, then I'll pass on to the rest of the panel, which is that the most exciting opportunity for the creation of mid-rise, and I would support it in Greenfield Extension and on brownfield sites, is with local consent allowing lower density housing to intensify into a more terrace or occasionally mansion block typology and find ways in which local people can essentially pre-approve that with council or with GLA support. I'll come back to that point, but I think we've got thousands and thousands of existing streets. If more of them end up like bits of Islington or bits of Kennington, as opposed to lower rise, lower density, when local people want it, that by some margin is the most efficient and the most sustainable way to create homes without needing large amounts of public subsidy.
Thank you. Russell?
I agree entirely with what Nicholas has just said. We know that there are optimum densities, I think, in all areas, regardless of whether you're in inner London or an outer London area. Low density ends up with car dependency and social isolation. Too high density, I think you end up with issues of loneliness and issues of isolation again. So there is an optimum density, which I think mid-rise development can offer. The issue is, and we'll maybe come on to talk about this in a second, is how you get to those densities in areas which are prevailing at low density, and that's a very, very big question that I think we need to interrogate.
I think you might have a panel of lots of people agreeing with each other in general. But I think, as a kind of summary thought, London is less dense than its equivalent megacity peers across the world. Its core is half as dense as the core of Paris. Its suburbs are much less dense than the suburbs in Japan. I've got a piece of research coming out in the next month that will sort of quantify all of that. I think, and so the objective isn't, or the question isn't rather should we or should we not rely on mid-rise. It's where should we expect mid-rise, where should we be, and then what can we do to make it, as much of it happen as possible in those places where it makes sense. And so I think the question should more be on like how do we achieve it, and the sort of main constraints to it being allowed are on planning and viability, and there are different things which I'm sure we'll discuss today which will make that more or less likely that you'll get more mid-rise happening. And it also won't be the only answer. There are some places where you want more than mid-rise to be happening, around train stations, more in central London, etc. And there are other places where, I mean, I read the Towards the London Plan document yesterday, and so there's a reference to mid-rise, and that means sort of 5 to 9 stories. There's a lot to be done, as I think my colleagues will talk about, in the sort of 3 to 5 story gap. And if that's mid-rise, then yes, but if that's not, if that's lower mid-rise, then we need more of that as well.
Thank you very much. And in many ways there, you've preempted my next question, which is that the current draft Towards the New London Plan document defined mid-rise as between 5 and 9 stories. How do you all think that mid-rise should be defined in the final plan? And do you believe density targets and approaches might have to differ between inner and outer London? I'll start with Maurice.
I don't have any strict sort of thoughts on what the definition should be. I think you should try and be as sort of place sensitive and as flexible as possible. I think one of the issues with the current London plan is that you have quite blunt cut-offs when it comes to policy. If you talk about affordable housing, it's just like 35% everywhere and 50% public. That is a kind of, and it's not working. And that is an illustration of what happens when you make those cut-offs too blunt and not responsive to place. So if we're thinking about mid-density, it's like, well, maybe we should have a different definition for intensification in the place which currently is low density and intensification in place which is currently mid-density. I think the emphasis should not be on how should we get more 5 to 9. It should be how should we increase density, whatever the start point is.
My feeling is that if you were to raise, for the sake of argument, the entirety of London's suburbs to 5 or 6 stories, we would be talking about millions and millions of homes. So I don't necessarily think that a threshold that goes up to 9 stories is necessarily that useful. My personal definition of mid-rise would be between 4 and 6 stories, partly because the regulatory framework makes it currently makes it very difficult to build anything between 6 stories and, say, 10 or 12 because of issues around second staircases and viability and fire strategies. So personally, I think a 4 to 6 threshold in outer London areas would be sufficient. I did admittedly quite crude, but a calculation looking at areas within 800 metres of suburban stations, which is about a 10-minute walk, and worked out that if you lifted all of those areas by 25%, so if you increased the housing density by 25% to a minimum of 40, you would deliver something like 850,000 homes. So, you know, even a modest uplift in density in some of these areas would yield a very significant increase in the number of homes in these areas in sustainable locations.
It's a very good and a very important question. And I think you are in danger, definitely, of getting panelled. We haven't prearranged our answers, just to reassure you all. So, yeah, I would instinctively start it lower. And I think I would instinctively not call it mid-rise. The phrase we at Create Streets have been using for many years now around the country is gentle density. And that may just sound like I'm making a semantic distinction, but the reason is twofold. One is that actually height isn't the primary. It is important, but it isn't the only driver of the density you achieve. The point we're talking about here is really density rather than height. Height is a function. Height feeds into density, but so does ground cover and the typology of housing. So I'd instinctively call it something else than mid-rise, which sort of forces you to think in number of stories, and that's actually only one of the drivers that you need to think about. That'd be point one. Point two, agreeing with my panel colleagues, I'd start it lower. So I think if you're, I often say, and indeed Andrew has heard me say this before, but I say that the terraced house is, if you like, is the platonic ideal of housing, in that you're giving a home with its own back garden and control of your environment to a much higher number of people on a much smaller footprint, because you're going up, several stories, than you are with semi-detached or detached housing. So you're getting most of the advantages of a detached house or a semi-detached house. Should add that in a poll done a few years ago, this is national, not London, from memory, 69% of British people said that their preferred housing choice was a detached house. And you get, by the way, you get very similar percentages, I think, in every country that's ever been polled. You get most of those advantages in terraced housing. So I would definitely push down your definition. I'd think in terms of density. And if you've got neighbourhoods where you're mainly terraced houses, you can have the odd semi-detached or even detached, with some mansion blocks, 4, 5, 6, you can go up to 9 stories in some places. It won't normally be necessary. That's how you get those trade-offs working best. So nothing against having stuff at 8 to 9 stories. I totally agree with the viability point. We've actually just done working with a viability consultant for a design code we're writing, not in London, but in a town near to London. Yeah, basically everything from 6 up to, I think from memory, 11 stories is totally non-viable. Either keep it below 6 or go above in the current environment. Hopefully that environment will change, but that's where we are at the moment.
Thank you all very much. Oh, yeah, Maurice.
Just to make a point on that, what I don't think you should do is respond to the current non-viability of the 6 to 11 by writing policy towards that being precluded, if that makes sense. If a 9-storey building is the right one to happen in Zone 2, then notwithstanding the current environment, because of second staircases in the building safety regulator at the moment, meaning that's less possible, the London plan has to look into the long future, where a future government might undo or change things such that it is more possible to build that type of building. And the London plan should expect and encourage that, rather than having a definition which is defined by something which is different and more to do with building safety.
Yeah. So I do agree with that, but by the same token, I think Maurice will agree with what I'm about to say. If you're just focusing on that bit of mid-rise, therefore not much will be happening. So I would extend your definition so stuff can happen and you're creating good places. I'd broaden it rather than narrow it.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. And I think there's a spatial dynamic come out here where you've got different bits of London want different things, and I think we're all in agreement that 9 stories across most of suburban outer London isn't about to happen. So it's kind of semantic as to whether or not you include that.
Thank you all very much. Assemblymember Boff.
Mr. Boyce-Smith launched with where there is local consent. What do our other guests think about that criteria of where there is local consent?
Yes. Unfortunately, from my experience as an architect, consent can often be extremely difficult to achieve, almost irrespective of what you're doing. And we see, for example, where I live in Barnet, a lot of resistance to densification because people enjoy or value the suburbs as a 2 or 3 story character area. And as soon as we look to be building mansion blocks or taller buildings in areas close to stations, that inevitably ends up with a degree of resistance. So I personally feel that sort of consent should be qualified. There is a mechanism through which we do this, and I think that the problem is that we don't generally people don't engage enough with local plan creation, and so what happens is you have an inevitable argument at the point applications come forward. So we need to be much more engaged with the local plan process. But you know, we don't seek consent from the people that are going to benefit from the homes that we're building. We don't do it enough. That's a silent majority. I think evidence is starting to show that actually most people are in favour of new homes and new development, but they are not. They are the silent ones. They are not the ones that are able to coalesce around campaign groups and are locally politically connected and have the time and the ability to engage with planning lawyers and social media. So, you know, I am all for consent, but it needs to be reaching the right, a broad section of society, not just those local interest groups that are against development.
Well, I did say local consent. You were saying local consent's not that valuable, and we should get a broader consent beyond local.
And that's not quite what I meant. Apologies if I misspoke. We tend to ascribe. We assume that a vocal minority represents everyone, and I don't think that's the case.
Nobody makes that assumption.
I think, with respect, I think they do.
No,
they do.
No. Are you therefore arguing, for better forms of expressing local consent?
I'm arguing for more inclusive ways of engaging with all the beneficiaries of development, and not just those that are or see themselves as negatively affected by it.
Well, we're already engaged with the developers. You know, they're pretty well engaged, and those developers, you could argue, represent the people who want to buy their properties or take their properties off their hand. But it's the value that you put on local consent that I'm particularly interested in, and it doesn't appear like you're that concerned about local consent. Yeah, please answer, because I don't want to.
No. It's not that I'm not concerned about it. I just feel like I feel as if it's skewed, and that we assume that because there is a loud opposition to development in a local area, that is representative of the entire community, and I don't believe that's often the case.
Okay. This is a long argument because, of course, the local planning committee can judge whether or not that particular voice that's being expressed has the real consent of the local community. That's why we have a democratic structure in place to deliver that. Mr. Lang, what about local consent?
I think when it comes to questions of public consent, there's a multi-stage democratic process by which we have London representatives and we have local representatives and we have national level representatives. The London population gives its consent to the London Mayor to make strategic decisions on housing, and it shouldn't be underplayed the extent to which a vote for a mayor who says they're going to deliver more housing is consent for that. I think also then when it comes to the way that local consent, and then, you know, if the London population reacts negatively to to a mayor who's delivering more houses, then they can vote them out, and that is a different way by which consent is exercised, and that is the democracy that we live in. And then secondly, when it comes to sort of the way that local consent is exercised, the UK is incredibly peculiar in the way that it has all local consent, the process of consenting, focused on after an application has been received, which, as Russell said, focuses the nature of that local consent gathering process on particularities and on things which you need a lawyer and you need you need to be watching the planning website to see when the planning application is coming through to be able to participate in that process. In other countries where they have local plans and they have what the equivalent of a supplementary planning document would in a zoning system or whatever, that moves that question about consent further up in the planning process, it means that you can engage on a sort of more a local strategic level with a range of actors who will be able to go along to an event where you're thinking about how tall would we like things to be around here, given a load of constraints that might have been set by a higher level authority, for example, at a London level. And that, I believe, is a much better way of gathering local consent than on a case-by-case basis, which precludes most people from engaging in that process. I don't think you're right to assert that people don't care about local consent if they're saying that we should be thinking at a strategic level. I think the strategy is part of the necessary part of the planning process, and if it gets reduced to that discretionary element of the planning system, then we fail to plan effectively at all. And we don't deliver anywhere near as many homes as we need to.
Wouldn't you say waiting till a mayoral election in order to express your view about a local planning application is a rather blunt tool for democracy?
I think housing operates on a multi-decade timescale, and if you're making strong decisions, then you need to be thinking that housing decisions are made with a long-term view, and that can't be done on a case-by-case basis.
Do you know of any candidate for any party for the mayoral elections who has stood on the platform of less housing?
No, but the current mayor stood on a platform of delivering more homes than he has been able to deliver to this point, and so it would be reasonable for him to make decisions which would deliver more homes.
Yes, but ultimately the decision isn't his only through the London plan, it's planning committees. And anyway, thank you.
May I just say one quick thing? I know Mr. Boff didn't direct the question to me, but it's such a crucial question, and I'm going to try and both agree with my panelists and also see if Mr. Boff agrees with my answer. That point about the peculiarity of the English planning system is so important and axiomatic to this discussion that I think it's really worth sort of triple underlining it. We have been running a controlled, or perhaps an uncontrolled experiment in how we do planning for the last 80 years, where we have a very, very discretionary system. And if you like, we move the democracy down, as Maurice was saying, into each individual planning decision. In parallel, the public have lost trust that new development will make existing places and their home and their neighbourhood, about which they are legitimately emotional, better. In a YouGov poll done a few years ago, 2% of the public, 2%, that's not a typo, 2, nothing else behind it, trusted developers to make existing places better with new development. And I'm afraid to planners present, I'm afraid the figure for local planning authorities and planners was 7%, which is better, but still not ideal. So until we face into those two facts and find ways, because I do passionately, as Mr. Boff knows, I do passionately believe in local consent, all our work is about it, but to move the democracy forward and find systemic ways to say, right, across this whole area, what is an acceptable way of intensifying these streets that you, the residents, will accept? Not on a case-by-case basis, because I totally agree that will never work, but for ideally hundreds, thousands, certainly dozens of homes. I can give examples, I won't do that now, I might come back to that, but I think unless the London plan and certainly local borough plans are thinking in terms of how you use local development orders, supplementary planning documents, design codes, pattern books, pre-approval, based on what local people will accept. Unless we're into that conversation, if I say I would advise you're in that conversation, we will never even start to solve our housing problem, because we cannot rely just on greenfield and on a very finite number of small, high-intensity brownfield sites. We've got to learn to intensify with consent. Sorry,
I just in response to that, thank you for clarifying that. Nobody's arguing that the planning process is perfect. You'd be mad to. But any change in the planning process that doesn't include local people surely is the wrong step.
So I think the same to me. So yes. Let's take a London example. I'll give you non-London ones as well. You know, the South Tottenham supplementary planning document from about, I think, 13, 14 years ago, did a careful pattern book for going up a story in a series of streets that was based on local feedback, based on very clear local desire. It essentially said you can go up a story, add a story and a half, following this pattern book that fits in very tightly and carefully. So it was very directive. It wasn't for a world-leading heritage architect to do a carefully considered response to that building. It was this is good enough, this local people will accept, as long as you follow this, off you go. Last time one of my team looked at the numbers, and it would have changed since then, that had created 200 additional extensions over a decade period, with essentially no public funding other than writing the policy in the first place. That's probably 600-700 bedrooms in an area with very high demand and very high prices, where the additional value of an additional story and a half is probably £300,000 to £400,000, and the build cost is probably £150,000. So, that's, I think, how you square the circle of the need to change the process, the need to intensify, but in a way that local people will accept, and start to see development as the answer, not the problem.
If I may, Nicholas has made the point more eloquently than I did. I think the point I was trying to make is that the point at which the local democratic process should take place is at a strategic level, and the adversarial nature of planning applications that come in and are a surprise or are then thought about at sort of planning committees and the stages leading up to a decision is problematic. So I would much rather that we have an honest discussion about the fact that we do need to build homes. We together, collectively decide where they need to go. And the idea that a developer can buy a site, spend millions of pounds on a planning application, and then put that planning application, have that determined with a recommendation for approval, and it to be turned down at committee is frankly is nonsense. And these decisions should be made strategically much earlier, so there is buy-in from the local community.
And I think there's a really important role for the London Mayor to play, because you're right that even if you got decisions at a local level moved upstream on a borough-by-borough basis, there is still strong possibility in reality that the local politics of that area would determine that you get a strategy which is in what those people in that borough would want, but is not in the broader interest of London as a whole. And there's definitely in an outer London dynamic in that regard. And so I think there is a role for the London Mayor to play in saying, outer London boroughs, you have to deliver, and then it's for that outer London local authority to be like, we've been given this target, we need to meet it, and then they do their local level engagement to work out how they do that. That is completely the normal order of things internationally. In Paris, the Parisian mayor would do that, in that they would allocate a housing target to their constituent boroughs, and then they would even have the power to implement a zone where they thought it was in the city interest over and on top of the existing communes. So I think when we're looking at what the London Mayor's role here is, it is to take a very strategic view, and it is not necessarily to let the boroughs decide in all instances. That is the purpose of the London Plan. That is the democratic process that we're going through at the moment.
Assembly Member Garbett.
Thank you. I've got a question about a slightly different topic, but as part of this introduction, would anyone like to speak to the advantages of mid-rise housing in terms of London's net zero targets and sustainability?
The options for building a high-rise, mid-rise gentle density, or going out into greenfield sites. High-rise buildings tend to be less energy efficient to manage and use more energy on a per metre cubed basis. There's good evidence in that from London and from a couple of other cities. So in terms of energy in use, they're less energy efficient, and they cost a lot of energy to build. But once people are in them, the lifestyles they lead are energy efficient because they're likely to be using public transport and active travel because it's likely to be high density. Sprawling out into the countryside will create buildings that may last longer, but by definition will be using more infrastructure because you're going out into the countryside, and is likely to be creating more car-based lifestyles. Now, for the moment, that's associated with lower energy efficiency and less sustainability. As cars electrify, that will actually evolve and change a bit over time, so I think we need to be thoughtful about how that may look 10 or 20 years from now rather than now. I think the case I would make for mid-rise, for gentle density, for intensification of existing streets is not only is it quicker, but by definition, you're making much better and more efficient use of existing infrastructure. You're using the streets that are there, literally with the pipes under. You might need to upgrade them a bit, but you're essentially going with the... And, I'm a historian by background. This is how towns used to grow. Go to the City of London, Go to look at the Strand running between the City of London and the City of Westminster. Well into the 18th century, the north side of the Strand was basically 2 stories high. It's now sort of 9 or 10 or 11. That's a very sustainable and sort of historically normal way for cities to evolve. So, no one answer gives you the answer to everything, but as a way to growing sustainably and beautifully, I think it is a key part of the answer, probably the best part of the answer. I hope that's helpful.
I agree entirely. And come back to my earlier point about the optimal densities. We know that, as Nicholas has said, the outerlying low-density areas that are reliant on cars are, inherently less sustainable because of car use, but also from an embodied carbon and an operational carbon point of view are less successful. We're creating far more external envelope, using far more materials in detached and semi-detached houses than we would be in mid-rise blocks. Once you start to build at sort of optimal densities, you're less reliant on private vehicles to move around. You're probably closer to both public transport and social infrastructure, shops and community centres and all those sort of things. But also the operational and embodied carbon involved in building mid-rise blocks is significantly better than the low-rise alternative, as Nicholas has said, also in high-rise as well. So I think it is right to build at mid densities, gentle density, for all sorts of reasons.
Maurice, sorry, just before you answer, can I just extend a warm welcome to Year 5 students from Manor Primary School in Barking Dagenham, who are here in the public gallery today. It's a real pleasure to have you with us.
Oh, sorry.
Maurice.
I live next door, sorry.
I don't have all that much to add. I think there's a really interesting and complicated mathematical exercise in working out exactly what the best lifelong whole life sort of strategy for housing is. And I think some of the most meaningful things could be to do with how we manage the existing housing stock. But that's not to say that doing that means you don't need to build new homes. And you can and then I guess another point I would make is that demolition has become an incredibly contentious point in the UK sort of housing debate. We demolish far fewer homes than our international comparators do, and that has a strong relationship with our lack of density. Other cities are more able to evolve towards higher density lifestyles, higher density living, which has knock-on effects to the kind of lifestyles that people live than we do because of attitudes and planning regulations which interact with whether things are demolished or not. And so I think, if you have a large detached housing plot with a massive garden and it's near a train station in outer London, there is a very strong pro-demolition argument for knocking it down and building 20 flats. That's very possible. We've seen that happen in Croydon, which I'm sure we can talk about a bit more. But the delivery of a lot of homes on exactly the same amount of land where that does require demolition justifies that demolition. And I think there's the conversation around embodied carbon is a very delicate and needs to be as accurate as possible, but it needs to not mean that demolition is the wrong thing in all circumstances. The same thing would apply with if you've got a 4-storey block in inner London and you're going to make that 10 stories, you've added a lot more homes there. If all you're going to do is have a 4-storey block and build another 4-storey block, then your embodied carbon for refurb versus not is really strong. But I think there needs to be a sort of a shape of the city perspective when it comes to going, is demolition or not the correct thing to do? Because not building more in that 4 to 10 scenario means that you either have house prices go up over the long term or you build the equivalent on the outskirts. And at the moment, we just do a bit of both. We build some on the outskirts and we don't build as enough homes. And so that would be my sort of one addition to try and help sort of frame the conversation.
Yeah, and I just think it is obviously all of those different things in the balance, isn't it? Because often when there has been demolition and people have returned to the new build, sometimes rents go up, service charge go up, they become unaffordable. So it is that kind of in the round what the homes we need to build and then who is able to live in them.
Yes, but in some cases where you've had rents go up, that's because you knocked down a bad building and you built a new one, and the new one was significantly better than the old one was, if that makes sense. And I think there's some analysis on sort of how much new builds drive up rents, which I don't think takes as London housing market wider perspective enough. But I completely see that argument, and where we've had instances where you've had a lot of social homes and none of them replaced, I think that's obviously a bad outcome for the local community, right? Where you have too much of our densification happens via estate regeneration. We need to have planning reform to make it much easier for private land to be recycled into more housing, and that pushes all the more dependency on public estate regeneration. But where that public estate regeneration is increasing the amount of social homes and adding private, I don't see that as a bad thing.
Assembly Member Moema.
Thank you. That last response made my heart sing. But I wanted to ask you all, you made a point, Nicholas, about the way in which South Tottenham had a kind of a plan to basically add a level to everything. It's possible to walk around London and look at some older houses in particular that might be a nice row of terraces, but they're 2 or 3 stories. Think, if you stuck a new level on that, that would be more space. I guess my question is, in this context, though, how would you kind of make a programme of increasing density through that process, where you're adding new flats to existing buildings, as opposed to adding an extension to a private house? Because I think the difficulty would be that the benefits would accrue to that private individual, and there wouldn't be any additionality. And I don't know if it speaks to the point you were making about looking at how we can increase density with existing stock, without kind of removing the fact that sometimes demolition is the right answer if it means that you get a better quality, better designed and easy to maintain home, and there are more of them. I think that's the bit that I'm not quite clear on, because I would want to see, if we're adding levels to places, floors to buildings, that they are new homes for new people, and therefore going towards the London plan and getting people off housing waiting lists, or letting private individuals buy homes if they want to.
I think it's a very good question. Intensification of existing streets will involve both the creation of new homes, or should involve, and does, both the creation of new homes and new bedrooms. I'm just going to make the case for new bedrooms in and of themselves, just because I think it's a conversation worth having. There is analysis, I should say, showing that as the proportion of empty bedrooms decreases, either there's more constrained supply, levels of homelessness go up. So it isn't a bad thing to have additional bedrooms in our current housing challenge, and I would argue that both at the GLA and at the council level, there should be a new homes target. I'm not in any way making a case against that. I'm just saying we should also, addition of bedrooms is a good thing to housing affordability and choice for all of us. It might be it's rented out, and yes, I agree that would go to the existing homeowner. It might be it's rented out as a lodger. It might be that it's to children coming back from university. It might be that it's used for, a cousin who's got themselves a job and needs to move somewhere quickly. And it just adds to the flux and the flexibility of our overall housing supply. So I would make not a case against new homes, but a case pro new bedrooms. So let's not let the best be the enemy of the good, would be partly response. There are also, I think it's fair to say, quite a lot of buildings which are big enough. I mean, think, for example, of places like South Kensington or bits of West London, where and in fact, a lady in my team has worked on one of these, where the frame of the building is big enough that if you go up a story or two, you probably are creating 1 or 2 additional flats up in the upper stories. And you will also, back to the earlier important question on sustainability, by putting in the new roof, you will almost certainly, in fact, you will be, increasing the energy efficiency, not just of those homes added to the top of the building, but actually also for the homes below. So is it all we should be doing? I accept the terms of your question, no. But particularly where it's about existence, comes back to Member Boff's question, where it's about local communities accepting quite profound and wide-spaced intensification. There will be times where you can imagine semi-detached becoming a row of terraced or rows of mansion blocks with local consent. There are different mechanisms to do that. But in some, where you've got existing streets, maybe in a conservation area. I'll give an example, another one. Often this will be conservation area listed buildings. Lots of older London houses have what are called butterfly roofs, which go in like that. Absolute nightmare if you own one, because they tend to leak here. Until about 70 or 80 years ago, it was very normal for them to get mansarded, to use a French word, and essentially add 1 or 2 bedrooms. Now, there's a local development order that was put in place last year in West London for a ridiculously small number of homes, for reasons I can come back to if you want, just for 12 homes. In the last year, just over a year now, of those 12 homes, 5 are literally today physically building 2 bedrooms each, and I happen to know a 6th one is about to start. That is creating extra bedrooms at no cost to the state, in a very sustainable pattern. And here's the good news. Those houses, although the LDOs for local development was for a ridiculously small number of houses, this model of house, 5.5, 6 metres wide, I can't remember exactly how wide they were, is essentially something, we've all seen many thousands of these built within a certain time. So you could here's a role for GLA, you could take that pattern book and you could make it download and freely be available, because the people there, they were sort of moneyed part of London, they put in resources, they persuaded the council. You can come in and help. Some will be private owners, quite a lot of historic housing is owned by housing associations or by councils, certainly in North London more than in South London. So some of this will go into additional bedrooms for affordable housing, some will be additional homes. So I would make that case, and I think there's a space there for the GLA to normalise it and make the intellectual material available and usable by streets, councils, neighbourhoods all over the city. I hope that's a helpful question, not a criticism.
Yeah.
Just one point to add. Across London, there are a lot of local plans which have a strong presumption against subdivision. And I think that can be problematic in a lot of ways. If you are extending upwards or outwards homes and then subdividing them into smaller dwellings, I think that can be and obviously that also counts on your housing targets. I think that can be there's a strong case for that. The issue is how you control it and how you ensure that these are not becoming HMOs or some other sort of substandard form of accommodation. But I think the prevailing presumption against subdivision is problematic, and we need to be, as Nicola said, finding ways to codify extension and subdivision in a way that delivers new homes. Now, I think, as Nicholas has said, terraced houses are sort of, in a way, an optimal form of development. And realistically, we are not going to be demolishing estates of Victorian terraced homes, at anything at scale. So we need to find some way of intensifying those. And I think degrees of extension and subdivision within an established framework are probably a way to achieve that.
I think I wouldn't see the two things as being mutually exclusive. I think if we moved towards a system where you had more local authority, you had a mayoral direction which said local authorities please produce design guides and other supplementary planning documents or local development orders towards XYZ end, then you could imagine multiple existing in the same place, and then you would imagine a combination of things happening. You would have some private households who had a 3-bedroom house and built an extra story, enjoyed it for a bit, sold it, fine, good. You'll have others which will be subdivided, and you'll have others which are demolished. And I think, if you look at what Croydon did with their supplementary planning document, they had lots of different things. What they didn't do was allow much upward building, but they did allow a lot of between plots and sort of taking 2 semi-detached houses and replacing them with blocks of flats. I think in terms of contribution to overall housing supply, it is more likely that you will get more from the big, small sites than you will get from a very sort of trickle of adding one story here and there, I think. But that will all interact with the land values in the given place. So if you are, it's why sort of planning reform won't work in the same way in one part of the country as to another part of the country. And that will change over time. I was speaking to someone yesterday who thinks that what we saw in Croydon, which, as an example, was they basically made it, you got permission in principle for knocking down a detached house and building 10 flats. And that the amount that was delivered of that type of house went up by 300% as compared to previously, which delivered an extra 450 homes a year over the 4-year period that the planning document was in place. So it was a significant increase. It wasn't all of Croydon's demand, but it was a lot. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought. So the contribution of that was much more than what you've seen some inner London boroughs do when they've said, OK, you're allowed to do a one-storey increase. I think, Russell, you did some work with Lewisham.
Yeah.
And I think if you look at the supply change before and after those plans are brought in, the one where it was allowing more big stuff to happen had more of an impact. And so if I was to direct attention for what a mayor should be trying to facilitate, it would be more of the big, small to medium-sized sites. I think the mansard thing is good, should be done, but won't be a big part of the solution on the basis of data I looked at.
Assembly members, we are running quite significantly behind time. I know it's a really interesting discussion, but we need to keep our questions as tight as possible. Assembly member Lord Bailey.
Mr. Curtis, I took your earlier comments about consultation to mean how do you consult with the community that is yet to arrive. I took it as an attempt to be broader, not narrower. The conversation we've just had about adding 1 or 2 bedrooms using mansard tactics, for instance, is impossible if it's done on a case-by-case basis, because you'll always find someone who disagrees for their own strongly held reasons. So I think your concept about why you'd push it to that level, and then Maurice, because I can't need my glasses, I can't read your surname, sorry, and Maurice's response to how it might be done, I think are very, very, very relevant and are realistic and something that Mayor absolutely should look at. So I just wanted to put it on record because I thought and continue to think you're in the right place on that. It brings me to my question is, how viable are mid-rise schemes from an economic point of view? Much of the understanding in London is building has ground to a halt in London. If you speak to developers and councils, they'll all tell you about viability. Are mid-rise schemes any likely to be more viable? And if they're not, what would make them more viable?
The sad reality is that in most parts of London, building homes simply isn't viable at the moment. The cost of construction, the cost of land, all of the constraints on building, it's a compound effect of a lot of different things. And I read, I think, somewhere this morning that, but basically, if you can't sell a property for more than £650 a square metre, roughly £6,500 a square metre, if your values are not higher than that, then you cannot build anything. My feeling is that what we're talking about in terms of mid-rise, I'm specifically talking about 6 stories or below at the moment, because that comes in below the threshold for high-risk buildings. Is probably viable in most cases at the moment in higher value areas. It depends where it is. If you speak to some of the volume house builders, and there was an interesting discussion recently in Enfield, where the mayor is looking to significantly increase density around Cockfosters and Oakwood Station. And the land there is controlled by volume house builders, it's actually much, much more financially viable for them to build straightforward family homes, sort of houses, than it is for them to be building flats because of the values. So if the problem we have is that at the moment the only way to deliver homes is through the kind of housing that we probably don't want to be building.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Nicholas?
I'm not sure I'd add much to add to that other than one very quick point, which is that, and anyway, come back to the earlier conversation, if we can, through de-risking planning and development, make it easier for smaller developers, SMEs, self-builders, custom builders to build, they don't need a financial return. Previous conversation about bedrooms, I agree it's not about bedrooms, but you don't need a financial return in the same way if you're intensifying existing plot that you own. You just need it to, you just need to be able to afford it and get the debt finance to do it. So I think I agree with all that. And if we can be empowering millions of Londoners, either directly themselves or by contracting out to someone else or by selling on to someone else, just to get lots of small things happening in lots of ways. I think I might have a rare point of modest disagreement on the panel between me and Morris. I would put much more focus on the importance of intensifying existing streets versus very high density individual sites, which right now are not viable, but there's really not that many of them. So I'd stress the path to de-risking. So I used to work in finance and in other bits of the industries, different industries before I had moved into this world. The thing it took me some years to get my head round, because it was just so odd to me, was the critical importance of the money that you spend as a developer before you have planning permission. Because if you do not win planning permission, interesting turn of phrase, not one you normally associate with a business process, if you do not win planning permission, you have burnt that money. And that's why you can't get bank debt. You need either public subsidy, or you need some sort of high-risk investor, or you just need to have a lot of money. That is not a sustainable way to create homes, affordable homes, every tenure you can imagine. We've got to de-risk that first part of the process. And once you can do that, we've done work with quantity surveyors and surveyors in various sites, mainly actually outside London. If you can really thin down the amount of money they need to spend at high risk, high cost of capital, then things become viable, which right now seem insanely viable. We've just a client we're working for, which is a local council outside London, has just sold a site because we worked with the council to put in place a supplementary planning document, very, very clear as to what the council will accept. So the developer has come in, a site that's not moved forward for 20 years, and suddenly knows it's really clear what is expected to build. It's mid-rise, it's gentle density, it's something that we've de-risked. We've shown that about 85% of local people in Lichfield like it. So they've got the politics is lined up. It's now an overall controlled council with a Conservative leader, Labour deputy. They agree on this. That's how we move this forward, by changing the politics and the risk to broaden that viability scope. And then there are additional issues that Russell mentions.
One more point, if I may. We need to stop conflating the development industry as a single thing. It is diverse, it is broad, and it is affected by different variables. We too commonly talk about the volume house builders and the SME developers in the same breath, but the negative impacts of or the impacts of planning, for example, or viability affect these sectors in completely different ways. And I'm very much an advocate of planning reform because I feel that it disproportionately affects SME developers, and our SME development industry has collapsed in the last few decades, and far too much of our housing is delivered by a very small number of very large companies. And of course those very large companies are beholden to their shareholders and will build and release homes at a pace that suits their financial return. SME developers are far more affected by the potential delays in planning and the uncertainty over planning outcomes. And so I think that's the area that we need to concentrate more on, because small developers tend to build a broader, more diverse range of homes, often of better quality and on more challenging sites. So we just need to make a distinction between those two very, very different strands of the industry.
Thank you.
Yeah, I didn't mean that the small sites, the really small sites are going to contribute nothing. I think it is very important that we do stuff to make getting planning permission for incremental development as easy as possible. I think that would be really important. I think when it comes to thinking about the viability of mid-rise, you have your basic components being planning cost and everything that Nicholas and Russell have already spoken about in terms of increasing the certainty that an applicant has going in, making sure that the system is as rules-based and as spatial, so I can point to this bit of land and say, this is allowed or this is not allowed here. As close as we can get to that, the lower planning cost will be, the more your SME developers would benefit. Then you have questions of build costs. Some of that is in the control of national government, putting levies on any building and the way that they do that. Second, staircases, I think, is a real problem for the viability of these mid-rise developments. It means you have less of your building taken up with homes, meaning that the amount of money you make is lower. Our second staircase requirements are unusually low as compared to some international comparators. Centre Cities did a piece on this earlier this year, but that's obviously not in the GLA's control. Then you have land costs, and I think some of the crisis that we're seeing at the moment is land costs not readjusting to prices not going up and costs going up more than that, and you would expect some of the current problem to be undone as the market readjusts to the price that you'd expect to buy a piece of land for. And then I think there's also an additional role that the public sector, local authorities or the mayor can play in buying land and making sure that it is sold to a potential builder at a given price. And these are all parts of the puzzle towards viability. And then you have the sale price, so how much is the thing that you're building going to be worth in the end? Again, most of that is outside of the control of the GLA, but the things which are in control are what you're actually allowed to build within the building. And so there are two things in the London plan on that. There is space standards. Currently, the London plan adheres to the national minimums and then has a slight uplift for ceiling heights. It's a contentious subject, but for the single-person minimum at the moment is a 37 metres squared building, house. That is only just below the national average for the amount of space that any person in the whole of the UK occupies. Now, the economic logic of that means that only 50% of people would be able to buy that amount of floor space, meaning that you've precluded anyone coming in and building a house of that, a flat of that size for someone who's on below the average. And then you add to that the fact that someone who's going to be wanting to buy a small flat is all the more likely to be earning less than your average person, means that it is a constraint on developers being able to build one-bedroom flats if you have your minimum set too high, if I've explained that correctly.
I think No, because it's a conversation I've had with the mayor before, because everybody talked about rabbit hutches and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But I remember growing up, I was homeless for a long time, and one of my friends was housing what we used to call like a bedsit type thing.
It's like a halfway house,
Yeah.
and there is an allowance on that, but you're only allowed to stay in them for a maximum of 3 years.
But my point is, we argue about small house versus nice house, but when you're homeless, it's small house versus no house. I would have taken a small house every single time,
Yeah.
and I do think it's something we should look at.
Yeah, and I think, I was speaking to a woman who's living on a council estate the other day, and she was saying to me, why are they not building some small rooms for all of the boys that are still stuck at home with their mums, and they don't want to be? And so I think you're quite right that there's a market and a demand, and people would happily live. In Paris, for example, the minimum is 14 metres squared. Now, that's very small, but people can make choices about
we might not go quite that small, but
exactly. I only say that to set to it's less than half what the London equivalent is. And I'm not actually sure on whether or not London plan is able to then go below the national minimum, which is 37. So it might again be outside of the GLA's control. I'm not sure. And then the other thing is affordable housing. At the moment, there's a kind of strict cut-off. Below 10, you don't have to deliver any, and then above 10, you get knocked into the rest of. I think there's a big gap somewhere in the middle where you have a different affordable housing policy for medium-sized things between 10 and 50, for example. And that could mean not delivering on site. It could mean replacing it with a levy, and then that's going to have to be really spatially tailored, because some places will be able to afford more or less land value capture through Section 106 to deliver affordable housing. So I think there's a lot of thinking that we can do on making the affordable housing sort of policy more intelligent and more responsive to the viability challenges, which have changed since the last plan, but also are different and have always been different for different types of development.
That's a very astute observation you've made there. Chair, I'm going to skip my next question, or you'll never get on time.
Assembly Member Baker.
Sorry, I was slightly taken by the skipping. So we have ever so slightly touched upon this, and we are also, as you know, running massively over time. But I think it's really important to ask this. It's about what we can learn from other cities. So if you could let us know what you think, anything you haven't already brought up, what London can learn from other cities that have achieved high-quality mid-rise neighbourhoods, and also where there are particularly good examples, either here, domestic or international, that you think we should be taking a look at. Anyone who wants to...
I'm happy to start. It's in my mind because I've just been writing something about it. So, so let me take the example of Paris, which we've already come up with, and Paris is easy to go and visit. You just have to go and get the train. Paris is building mid-rise, gentle density housing right now of quite astonishing quality and density. Now, part of that is about transport. So it is easier and cheaper in Paris to build trams than it is in this country. We've managed to regulate, it's not in regulation actually, we've more just put on industry standards that leads to every mile of tram in this country being between double and 3 times the average cost in Europe. So that's not something you can fix, but you can certainly lobby for its fixing and argue. And the great advantage of trams is it's a cheap train, not an expensive bus. It's much cheaper to run in terms of a ratio to drivers to passengers. It's certain and it's predictable. And the reason I mention trams is that trams is leading to new suburbs and neighbourhoods in Paris. They're also been building metros, that's more expensive, where the link back into the centre or the various centres of Paris justify now, because they're better and faster and more predictable, a greater density than has historically been the case. Now, they've got a more usable, as we put it, planning environment than we have, because they've got normally most cities, and all cities, what's called a code d'urbanisation, an urbanisation code, which mayors, if they wish to, they don't all, but they can use to do what we're talking about here, which is say, look, here's what's acceptable, get cracking. You know, I'm predefining it, so I'm accepting that I'm constraining the wilder reaches of originality or design, but I am making it very easy to build within that. So there are two stories I tell. One of a place called Plessis-Robinson, and one called Clamart, both in far outer Paris, sort of outer Bromley, outer Croydon. That's the sort of comparison. Mid-rise, average. I don't know what the average is, but certainly going up to 8 or 9 stories. Most probably more like 5 or 6. And they have evolved the Paris vernacular. By Paris vernacular, you can imagine the Titian limestone. But they've changed. I mean, it's recognisably Paris. In fact, the first time I went to Plessis-Robinson, which was about 2 years ago, this is a personal detail which I hope you'll indulge me with. I was with my family. My youngest son had fallen asleep in the car. As we arrived, he woke up, looked outside at a new bit of Paris, just outside Paris legally, and said, "Oh, we're in Paris." That was his response. It's selling at a massive premium to what it was before. The amount of social housing has stayed identical. It's gone up slightly, but not very much. But the density has tripled, and it is a better and more thriving and more prosperous place. I've walked around with the mayor. In fact, I was acting as his translator, explaining it to an English-speaking audience. And his little joke as he went round was, can you tell which of these is social housing or not? And, of course, you can't, because it is all beautiful and idealistic and marvellous. Clamart, just down the road, are now copying that. A new, much younger mayor has learnt the ecosystem, brought in some of the developers and similar architects. The value that they've created by having 6, 7, 8 stories has allowed them to put a lake in the middle of an old industrial site, series of buildings around it, different to historic Paris, but identifiably similar, far more balconies. Massively more attractive, looking out on this lake they've created. I mean, it's. I get emotional about this sort of thing. I was almost in tears going round. It is so marvellous. You literally almost cannot imagine that this is new, and yet it is all less than 10 years old. So those are 2 ones. I'll stop now. That I would recommend going to see for a nice time, as well as for the ratio.
Sounds lovely. I'll put it on my list. Thanks. And I expect that if there's anything else any other areas that you can't that you want to send us in, then that would be good. Russell?
Yeah. I mean, this is not an area of my expertise, but my understanding is that Auckland and New Zealand has, if not made it much more permissive, almost compelled intensification around stations or around transport nodes. And I think that's had a significant effect on I don't know what mechanisms they've used to achieve this, but it's had a profound effect on rents and house prices. But actually, we saw this in Maurice talks about Croydon. Croydon did deliver nearly 2,000 homes on sites of fewer than 10 in the 3 or 4 year period from 2017, 2018 onward. It effectively. It gave you absolute certainty that if you bought a house, a single house on a large plot or a pair of semis, that you could replace that with, in some cases, 20 or 30 flats. It gave you absolute certainty that you would get planning for that. And because of the certainty, the developers actually built out. They knew what their exit would be, and they knew that there was no point in trying to constantly extract more and more value by selling it on and somebody coming in with a new application. They knew what the site could accommodate. Now, the problem with the Croydon SPD was that it was concentrated in a small number of locations, and that had a absolutely profound effect on the character of those areas, which is why it was politically well, it was very, very difficult, and ended up being scrapped by the incoming mayor. I think if you applied that logic to London as a whole, and allowed automatic, or within certain safeguards, automatic replacement, for example, on corner plots. I'm a big fan of replacing detached houses on corners, because the impact of those are probably less than they might be if it was in the middle of a street, but also it assists with wayfinding and orientation, and brings some character in. So if you allowed for automatic approval for the replacement of large houses on corners into the suburbs, then actually I think you could get to a densification, the kind of densification that I've been talking about, very, very quickly. And we know also from Croydon that some research was done by the GLA's data team that house prices and rents levelled off as a result of the delivery of this number of homes.
With Maurice's permission, can I say one very quick thing on Croydon? I'll be very, very quick. Sure. And again, I may be gently disagreeing, but in a courteous and friendly way. The problem with Croydon, as you just touched on, was it wasn't endurable, because it didn't politically work. So I will repeat my point. You've got to do it in a way that people who live there recognise. It may be changing, but they see it as still there. From my conversations with people who lived and were affected by that, they regarded it as something alien, changing the nature of their homes and their streets in a way that they emotionally didn't like. Now, I'd be very respectful to that, as I know you are, Russell. So that's why it does matter what it looks like, what it feels like, the pattern, and getting that consent. So I think a lot was right about it, but something very important was very wrong, which is why it didn't endure. And I think we're all trying to get ways that are not just consensual but can endure.
Yeah. Thanks, that's really helpful. Thanks.
I think I'll disagree with Nicholas, saying I think the reason it didn't endure is because of the character of local politics, rather than because the bits of Croydon that were being redeveloped. I've done some analysis where I take all of the numbers of parcels that exist, which are of the size that were allowed in the policy, and it was a flip rate, so you've got a detached house, of 0.03% per year, meaning that it would take 300 years for the whole thing to reconstitute itself, or after a 100-year period, only 25% of the things would have changed. So it wasn't in sort of cumulative, and it was actually a lower rate than was modelled in the impact assessment before the thing was introduced. I think there's when you're going to say we want this place to change, you've got to accept that the thing is going to change. And I think that the reason that it wasn't politically durable was because the kind of decision about a place changing, i.e. moving from lots of detached houses to a mixture of detached houses and small blocks of flats, is a decision which is difficult. And that difficult decision needs to be taken at a higher level, which is more responsive to what that problem is trying to solve, which is the mayoral level. I think the mayor should make it much easier for local authorities to enact this kind of policy, because their political futures are not so dependent on it.
We'll come back to what the mayor and the GLA will come up.
And then
further questions.
To go sort of lessons internationally.
Can I just follow up on that though, because what you seem to be implying is that it's actually almost impossible to get local consent, even on a strategic basis. That's quite a challenging thing to say. It
depends what you mean by strategic basis. I think at a London.
Well, I think earlier on I think the panel all, I think you all sort of agreed that the best way to do it was to do it as a strategic level, on a sort of local plan level, and say this is the sort of thing we're going to do. Do you think that approach may have inoculated against some of the further problems? Because politics is politics. Yes, there are specific aspects of it at the moment, but politics. We have to find a way of doing this in a way that people are comfortable with. It's not an option not to.
I agree, but it depends which people, I suppose, and different political processes engage a broader
absolutely
group of people, and that's the point I'm trying to make. Is that kind of the higher the level, the more broad-based your base of support is, and if at a London-wide level we've gone, oh right, our prices have started to go down a bit, or it's more easy for me to find a flat, then those voters are going to would vote positively, I think. I think, to go back to your point about Auckland, I actually met the New Zealand Housing Minister last week, and he had some interesting reflections on that process. So what happened was they had a city-wide zoning. So imagine the London Mayor saying Croydon is allowed everywhere, and you're allowed something that's bolder than Croydon. They did that across the entirety of the city, and that was because of a national level directive, which then said, you've got to find space for this amount of homes, and the way they did it in first iteration was a very, very blanket thing, which basically said that any detached plot can now be 3 or 4 stories high. Now, that did get some kickback, and so rather than go, okay, we're going to accept that and we're not going to build as many homes, they are now revising their policy, and they are then going to do a mixture of places which are not upzoned, and as Russell was saying, intensify the amount of housing that they are allowing capacity for around train stations. But around train stations doesn't mean like 50 metres, it means like quite a lot of metres. And so if you take as a flat, like the housing number, if you take your 88,000 or whatever, your maximum goal, it's about how do we achieve that and how do we spread it out and how do we build capacity for that. And that is going to be a challenge for the Mayor to think strategically about which locations have capacity to be upzoned, and upzoning within a system which doesn't have zoning is very difficult, but you can do it, like we saw in Croydon, and thinking about sort of where those political trade-offs are, I suppose. But it's definitely, the London housing market is it's not one thing, but it's also not 32 different things. And so you've got to think about the relationship.
I'm going to ask more specifically about the Mayor and the GLA, so we can probably... Is there anything else on international comparisons that I want to...
No, only to make the point, again, that sort of, if you can say... One of the things in the draft London, in the Towards the London plan, is about
we are going to come back on the London plan.
To answer your question,
yes,
it says about heights, and you said in principle heights which could be allowed through the London plan. That would be in keeping with many international examples.
Okay, so. Thank you.
We are sorry. Just one more quick point. I apologise. Sorry. Just one. We are seeing around the world, particularly in the US. I think Austin and California have just brought in new legislation around replacing. I think the term is single-family plots or something. A directive that allows the intensification of single homes into blocks of flats. So we are starting to see around the world cities that are struggling with housing crisis. Implementing policies that I think we should be also implementing here.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. Back to you, Chair.
Assembly Member Lord Bailey.
How could
how could mid-rise housing be designed and integrated into new areas, such as, for example, in proposed new towns, because that's a real opportunity, blank page, just get it done in new towns, and also in greenbelt areas? Because one of the things that you've also said, Russell, we're getting on like a house on fire, you and I, is that you like the idea of corner plots. So I live in a part of the world, I live in Romford, where there's lots of big leafy roads, but we do have blocks at the end of the road, and I think that works, because I came from a really huge housing estate, which I think was horrific. So, in the context of new towns and greenbelt, how could they be designed to work?
We're talking about that's sort of two different questions, because new towns, presumably, one would have much greater control and over design coding, master planning, deciding strategically where you have different degrees of density and height and those sort of things, and also social infrastructure. The challenge around, so if I just talk about suburban intensification for a moment, the challenge around that is ownership. And what makes suburban intensification very challenging is the hugely fragmented nature of ownership in these areas, because these typically it's freeholds owned by individual private householders. So land assembly of lots of plots is a challenge to implement. And even if you were to look at a sort of street street votes, as it was called, but a sort of a street-wide plan where you get all the house owners together and decide you're going to do some kind of upward extension or whatever it is, there's always the chance that somebody within that, there'll be a holdout somewhere. And so my idea about corners is because the resistance or the opposition to that is probably less than it might be in midway down the street. So, as I say, you are probably not having to deal with issues of overlooking of neighbouring gardens if you're building up on a corner. You are building in a location that is probably suitable for sort of orientation and say wayfinding issues, and also it's a plot that you can buy that has access to the street. So to talk about Croydon again, there are some really lovely examples actually of where corner plots, where a land-hungry low house, either a bungalow or a two-storey building, has been demolished and replaced with houses. It doesn't have to be flats, but there's one really lovely example that was enabled by the Croydon SPD, where they took a rather prepossession corner house and replaced it with 7 very lovely family houses. So intensification doesn't necessarily need to involve 3, 4, 5-storey buildings. It can be. We can intensify on within existing areas as well on single plots. But it's all about the size of those plots, what's possible, and the ownership structure.
Nicholas, just a very specific question around new towns. So, in the planning and finance of new towns, should it be possible to? I don't want to use the word dictate, but heavily ask for low gentle density, these particular buildings. How would you encourage someone in coding a new town to put that in the code so this level of density, 4 to 6 stories, actually happened?
So to, I think, echo what Russell was rightly saying, I think this is a much easier problem than the intensification, and I think it's actually very doable. First piece of good news is that the place principles set out in the New Towns report the other day are actually pretty good on this. I should say that Craig Streets wrote the first draft of the suggested brief to Labour when in opposition. And I think that concept of gentle density, they renamed it, I think, ambitious density. But I think all that understanding of the trade-offs between personal space and control versus the advantages of density is inherent there in the strategy that's been set out for the government, which I think I would agree with. But I'd say gentle, not ambitious. And then these are largely going to be delivered probably by development corporations. They will be the planning authority. If they're wise, I hope they will be. They talk about local development orders, mayoral development orders, special development orders in the New Towns report. My article about it in building design was published yesterday. If you want more on this, just get that in there. But so they're saying the right things about putting a code in place, being clear what's acceptable, range of options, range of typologies, and if they're sensible, the development corporation will then essentially let a wide range of big developers, small developers, self-build, come in and build to that framework that's preset. So if they get the rules right up front, they essentially pre-grant planning permission within certain carapaces, set out the street pattern. It should be incredibly easy to do, and I would imagine in most situations, perhaps a little less so in some of the London places, it will be the wisest way to get the density we want, but in a way that doesn't create huge high build costs or then some levels of political resistance. So I'm actually reasonably comfortable and confident about that.
Okay. Back to you, Chair. Sorry, do you want to come in, Maurice?
I can say something very quickly to
go right ahead.
Amongst some pigeons, is that there are some places where really high densities are not appropriate, or even gentle densities are not appropriate. If you are building a new town on the edge of a thing, maybe this is the most likely place that you would have a new detached house being built. And so I think gentle is actually a better framing than ambitious, because ambitious suggests that detached house is not allowed. I think in the new towns we should expect, and you should grade this away from the transport node or whatever, some new detached and semi-detached houses being built, quite a lot of terraces and some blocks, and that low density is the most appropriate place in a city for it, and so it's not evil. maybe.
So, sorry, just one more time. Where's the most appropriate place for low density?
As far away from the city centre as possible.
Oh, okay, thank you. Just to make sure I'm getting it right. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. For our last question, Assembly Member Baker.
Surprised again. Sorry, I thought it was waiting for you. So my questions are basically about what we have touched upon again, which is what should the GLA and the Mayor and the London Plan do in order to promote mid-rise housing? So obviously we've touched upon it. Don't feel need to repeat anything you've said, but I'd like to be able to, because obviously that's what we do. We scrutinise that. Russell.
I think we need to make a distinction between intensification and infill. And in the London Plan, at the moment, as it stands, we talk about one or two things. There's a small sites, dedicated small sites policy, which is fantastic, so policy H2. But it really treats small sites as a sort of windfall. I mean, it does set out targets for each of the boroughs. But I think small sites they represent a strategic opportunity because if we typically think of them as individual plots within a neighbourhood, but actually if you start to think about them strategically and what the compound effect of lots of bits of infill are, it can be transformative and it can deliver very large numbers if we set a policy framework that allows it. The difference between that and the Croydon policy is that's about intensification. That is the replacement of existing buildings, and we actually need to do a bit of both. And we need to recognise that there is a difference between those two things, and the London Plan should perhaps say a little bit more about this, because I think, in areas that are already more dense, and quite a lot of inner London areas that are more dense, that are predominantly, let's say, terraced houses, there is always an opportunity for infill, and that's where you introduce a new dwelling within the curtilage or within the sort of the neighbourhood, not the replacement. In outer London, I think we need to concentrate on replacement, so intensification, and I think that's where the London Plan needs to speak more about, because we have seen, again, referring to Croydon, that if you have a Croydon type policy that is very permissive within certain safeguards, then that can have a significant effect on housing delivery, because it is also about delivery, not just consents. We have a lot of consents in London, but we don't have much delivery.
Thanks. Thank you.
I think I've said in the wrong part of the...
It's okay, sorry.
Hopefully it's still be written down. I think the only thing I'd add is there's a tension in the current London Plan between area character assessments and intensification. So there's this split imperative which isn't reconciled in the current London Plan, which mostly plays out in favour of the kind of heritage side of things, because the spatial element of the we should target intensification wasn't as clearly set out as it could be. And so you could reconcile that in two ways. You could make a requirement for character-based things to have designations for where character is allowed to change and make that clear, or you could say sort of the areas where we are promoting intensification is where that doesn't apply, if that makes sense. And so I think if the London Plan could clarify that, that would be helpful to people applying for planning permission, lawyers. Would be less requirement for lawyers, which would probably be good.
Thankfully, we have no lawyers on the panel to complain about.
My girlfriend's a lawyer, so it's...
We won't tell him.
I think I'll say 4 words and then explain more very quickly. Patterns, process, risk, and emotion. I think you as the GLA, have an incredibly important role to play. Take the best examples. There are examples already in London. There's certainly examples elsewhere in the country, and some semi-relevant examples internationally. There's obviously more work required to make them pertinent. Copy them, either put them in the plan or in associated documents, make them machine downloadable, set out the process that you suggest whereby local communities or local councils can adopt them, show where things that already exist. I mentioned that one in Redcliffe Road. I know it's modest in the big scheme of things. That could be extended across many thousands, certainly many hundreds of homes. That's as close to an easy win as you get. I mean, so put them in there and desperately encourage the repetition, and the copying and the de-risking of development, back to the points we were making earlier. So I think there's an enormous scope to do that. And, conscious that, I guess there are two officials present, but mainly politicians, do lean into that point about emotion. I think we've had many disagreements on this, but Croydon, I think, is one of our few ones. Look, place is emotional. We know this now from the research. You know that as politicians. When we've lived in this is an academic fact. When you've lived in a place for longer, you have got more emotional attachment to it, and there is an innate small c conservatism in most of us that then doesn't want it to change and doesn't do the type of clever research that Maurice quite rightly was doing in terms of the ratios. People don't think like that. At least most people don't, and I suspect Maurice recognises that.
What if I tell them 0.03%?
No, that doesn't cut it, as I know you know. So people have got to recognise that thing. So don't copy models that are just technocratic. Lean into the emotion. Get the visual preference survey polling done, which shows you actually remarkable consistency in what people will accept and where they'll accept intensification. So copy those patterns, share them, do a roadshow, talk to officials. And I think your role as politicians, if I may, is to help the planners be less technocratic and be more emotional about the intensification of existing places.
Thank you. Shall I? Back to you, Chair. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you, panel. We've now reached the end of the first panel discussion. I'd like to thank our first panel of guests for attending this morning and for your brilliant contributions. We'll now take a short adjournment of 5 minutes while we change panels. Welcome back to the London Assembly's Planning and Regeneration Committee. We now continue our discussion on mid-rise development and the London Plan, and I would like to welcome our second panel of guests. In the chamber, we have Michael Ball, Coordinator and Media Worker, Just Space. Welcome, Michael. We have Hannah Kapitanevich, Lead Researcher at Demos, and Shreya Nanda, Advisor at London YIMBY. Joining us remotely, we have Nicola Livingston, Professor in Real Estate, University of Glasgow. I will now go to... She's joining. Yeah, fantastic. We'll go to our first question, which is from Assembly Member Boff.
A question to all of you. You can give a nice brief response. What is a mid-rise home? What is mid-rise housing? Can you define it? Perhaps Ms. Kapitanevich.
You're starting with the person with the least housing and planning policy expertise, so you're starting with the right person. Yeah, this is not my sort of specific area. I'm here to sort of talk about the kind of how we involve the public in these questions. So
that's the next question coming.
That's fine. That's perfectly good response, Ms. Nanda.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen the definition 3 to 6 stories. Then I think some other places use a slightly higher definition, maybe around 4 to 8 stories. I think the mid-rise blocks in Paris that many people use an example are mainly 6 stories, sometimes up to 7. So those are the kind of densities I'd be looking at.
And Ms. Livingston, what do you think is a mid-rise development?
Hey there, am I okay? Can you hear me all right?
Absolutely can.
Great. It's lovely to be the floating head in the room here. I think mid-rise is really anywhere between 4 and 8 stories, maybe slightly more. Again, so much of it is very contextual when it comes to thinking about density in relation to the place that the density is happening in. But broad brush, you're looking at kind of 4 stories upwards to maybe even, 10 to 12 stories, depending on number of units.
That's quite interesting. And Mr. Ball, what do you think is the definition of mid-rise housing?
It's just very interesting because there's no definition in the London Plan. The guidance, there's no definition in the characterisation guidance, and it's a very poor relation. Where there's 84 references to tall buildings in the characterisation guidance, there's 7 references to mid-rise. It's all about context. So mid-rise in Finchley Road, mid-rise in Streatham High Street, they're mid-rise. They're 6 to 8 stories. Dolphin Square is mid-rise in Dolphin Square. It's fantastic. But you put any of those into Barnet or into Richmond, and they would look like tall buildings. So it's all to do with context, and it's also to do with the nature of them. Essentially, tall buildings are gated. Mid-rise don't have to be gated. There can be mansion blocks that aren't gated. There can be an openness about them and a feel about them, and that makes them fundamentally different from tall buildings.
And how are people's experiences of living in that mid-rise home? Do they differ from other experiences from living in different typologies?
The experience of people living in them?
Yeah.
Or around them?
Well, let's start with in and then go for out. Let's start with the experience of people actually living in those blocks.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. When you live in a mid-rise block, by definition, you're in a series of flats. You're in a community, and that community has to have some cohesion. I lived in a mansion block where we're all got a share of the freehold, and we have to make decisions about what we do, sinking funds and all that sort of stuff, what we do with the open space, etc. I've been in mid-rises in council blocks, and you have to have a similar approach because the council aren't providing it, so the community comes together, people come together. So they're much more communal experiences in mid-rise blocks. In general, I'm not saying this is always the case, but it's general, it's certainly my experience. But living around mid-rise blocks is also very different. As I said earlier, tall buildings are often, they're always essentially gated. Mid-rise aren't. And I'll give you an example, a really stark example, is St George's Wharf, which would be considered tall buildings. This is at Vauxhall. So the original stuff would be considered tall buildings in most places, but compared to the Vauxhall Tower, they look like mid-rise, and they feel like mid-rise. You can walk through them. They've got shops in, they've got a gym, they've got all sorts of access to them. The tall building, and I've been around them many times. I don't particularly like St George's Wharf, but it's available, open. The Vauxhall Tower, it's not, and I've never been near it. You can't get near it. So there's a fundamental difference in experience for communities of mid-rise from tall buildings, and obviously from traditional streets of 2 stories.
And this, Captain Arvich, the experience of people living in those mid-rise blocks, what do you feel about that?
So I don't have any specific polling on people's or sort of kind of research on people's attitudes to mid-rise housing specifically, but if it's helpful, I can share kind of people's views of kind of at a high level in terms of house building and kind of what are the conditions that make house building in an area more acceptable, which obviously could apply to mid-rise housing, but it's not specific to that.
Right. How about the experience of families in mid-rise blocks?
I don't have specific
Nothing specific on that. Mr. Ball, the experience of families living in?
Very, very definitely. I mean, I think families really benefit from mid-rise. I actually like bringing it. I brought up 2 sets of children, one in a mid-rise in a council block and one in a 2 up, 2 down semi-detached, and I much preferred the council block. It was, you were all in it together. You were sharing each other's kids. You were sharing each other's experiences. You went to the same school, etc., etc. It was good. It was great.
And do you think mid-rise has advantages for families over and above the very tall buildings?
Yes, precisely because of that. Many people I know live in tall buildings where they are they actually want to get out, particularly in council tall buildings, because they feel trapped inside those. But they don't know anyone else on other floors. There's a huge issue on that. It isn't always the case, and I'll give you a counterexample. Is some tall buildings in Kennington which were aimed for demolition, and there was a vote in the end for what was called Project Vauxhall, and the people in the high rises, they were given during this process of negotiation for about a year. They were given concierge, and the lifts were mended, and everything was cleaned up. They all wanted to stay. They didn't want the high rise to be demolished anymore. So there is an issue of quality, but they still don't know each other. And I went around canvassing in 22, and people didn't know each other. It was very, very striking.
Right, and the thing we heard about earlier was the potential for those mid-rise blocks to be subdivided. Is that a threat to the provision of family-sized homes?
Yeah, the great thing about mid-rise is that you can do all sorts of different sizes and shapes and arrangements. And also they are much more available to refurbish, retrofit, change, extend. Tall buildings are not. So they're far more flexible.
And in terms of residents' perceptions, Ms. Kapitanovich, what do people want about, what concerns people most about the design of new housing developments?
So we did some polling in April as part of our report, the Maybe Majority. And I can speak to sort of some of the data for London specifically in terms of answers to the question, to what extent would you support or oppose house building in your local area under the following conditions? And so we have sort of a list of conditions that we shared and have a sense of kind of what are the biggest priorities to people. So the kind of biggest priorities for people are, so these are the sort of conditions we listed, that affordability, unsurprisingly. So a share of new homes built would be at prices that were affordable for someone on the local average wage was one of the conditions. So 68% of people said they supported that, supported the building of new homes under that condition. Then the sort of next highest level of support was that planning regulations and rules for developers are strengthened to get more community benefits. So people want to see benefits for them, perhaps unsurprisingly again. 65% of Londoners supported house building under those conditions. That funding was provided by central government to invest in local transport infrastructure, including roads and public transport. 64% supported that. So investment in infrastructure, and then sort of the other kind of highest level of support was that the new housing development had a positive impact on the character and appearance of my local area. So 60% of Londoners supported new house building in their local area under that condition. What we did with this data actually at a higher level, which you might be interested in getting into or not, was we counted the number of conditions people supported house building under, and then categorised them into NIMBYs, MIMBYs and YIMBYs off the basis of that. So not in my backyards, maybe in my backyards, yes in my backyards. So I can also share that data if that's helpful, but that's a bit more high level.
That's data that you've done. Has that been shared with us? Yeah, it has. Good.
The London-specific data, actually, I haven't shared because it's not in the report, but I can share the London-specific data.
That would be very helpful. I'm not so sure that drawing the lines of NIMBY, MIMBY and YIMBY is such a good idea, but who knows? Ms Livingston, how can we incorporate the views expressed by residents in the design of denser neighbourhoods?
I think one of the things that Michael kind of touched on earlier as well is that he reflected on his own experiences of living in mid-rise housing, but we actually do not have a good sense of how people live. Once developments are completed, there's not a huge amount of research that's done to follow up how their lived experiences are impacted by the places that they're living in post-development. And I think these are the things that we need to try and do better in terms of understanding through more effective community engagement and on-the-ground research to understand how people live at various different levels of density. So much of it is about perception as well, in terms of somebody may think that they're living at a higher density, whereas actually in reality the density is rather low, and the way that they use spaces is very different, whether you're thinking of the way that you live internally or indeed externally, because the context and where you're located is inherently very important, and your capacity to access all the amenities and things that you need for day-to-day life is also really going to impact your quality of life and your lived experience too. So I think we do need to do better in terms of understanding how we live and how we could live better and the role that mid-rise housing could play in this. And I think if we look to examples in mainland Europe and even in Scotland, where people have been living in tenements, in flatted tenements for over 100, 150 years in Glasgow and Edinburgh and doing so very successfully. We can look to other cities that have actually employed mid-rise density quite well. The Scandinavian models too, where, Stockholm, Copenhagen, that has a much higher population density than London, where they live at medium density and use that kind of, that way of construction, but also they effectively think about the design and the context of the locality and what they want the spaces to be and the nature of the provision that they're providing as well. Because, it's important to be able to provide for everybody within the community and people at different levels of their housing careers as well. To go back to what Michael said about people with families too. London School of Economics actually a few years ago, I think it was 2020, did a report that actually looked at the experiences of people who were living in higher density across London. I think they looked at 14 different developments. And one of the key findings that came out from that was that most people who were living in high density were generally very content to be there, but their idea of a sort of family home and a home where you would have children was still the traditional house. They would move out of a higher rise density because they just saw that it wasn't somewhere that they would raise family. So I think some of these challenges could be kind of observed in mid-rise density as well.
And to what extent, people could be happy virtually anywhere if you spend enough money on it. And to what extent do denser developments require more investment in maintenance than other less dense developments?
I think it depends on the nature of the development as well. It depends on the approach of the developer too. It depends on how they're operating within the planning system and their kind of approach to things like the drive towards net zero and sustainability gains when they're constructing buildings as well. Obviously in the shorter term, that's going to be a much larger cost for a developer to consider in terms of their viability assessment, but in the longer term, that's going to be much better for them over a longer life cycle of a building. So I think, again, it depends on time horizons, but certainly, you know, the maintenance and the way that you manage higher rise buildings can be and is the second biggest cost for an investor or developer after actually developing the building. It's the cost of the operations and the maintenance that they've got to consider. And yeah, once you get over, you know, your mid-rise into your higher rise, then you've got a lot of other things that are going to be costing additional. Yeah. Well, you're going to have additional costs to bear in terms of, you know, the safety regulator and various other elements that are going to potentially boost your construction costs overall, and your maintenance in the longer term. But then again, if you're developing at a higher density, you're going to have more people living in the building, and they're, you know, you should be able to recoup some of those costs back through either selling or renting as well. So it's just about trying to find that balance and finding a way in which policy can kind of encourage that balance too.
It's just that those increased costs of maintenance are typically not borne by the developer. They're borne by the resident through service charges. Is that accurate to say? So actually, the developers are off the hook once the thing's built, and it's then the residents who have to foot the bill. Is that a fair assessment?
I would say it's fair to an extent, but it also depends on the developer, and it depends on whether they're a developer investor with a longer term time horizon and interest in that building. Certainly service charges are used to recoup some of the costs, but any responsible developer investor in the longer term will have sinking funds and will have capacity to be able to respond to immediate issues to do with maintenance and those costs as well. So there should be something still built into their cash flows if they are a responsible landlord.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Assemblymember Lord Bailey.
Thank you. I'm coming to you first, Hannah. What makes people support or oppose mid-rise housing? Is it more popular with people than high-rise housing, for instance?
So I don't have specific research on attitudes to mid-rise or sort of housing depending on the rise, the height.
But when you're, because what's interesting is, if I take Mr. Bell's comments, I wonder, is it the topology of the building or the quality of the building that is most important? As well, Mr. Stand, you please come in and answer. Because I have lived in 2 council blocks, well, in fact I've lived in several, but I lived in 2, which were almost exactly the same, but my experience in them was wildly different. One had aluminium windows that it was optional if they stayed in. So therefore I have a very negative view of that building. And it wasn't about the size or shape of the building, it was about the fabric of the building. So are mid-rise buildings more likely to have a better fabric? Are they cheaper to maintain? Are they built better because they're less specialist to build? Or why would a mid-rise building be of any more merit rather than a high-rise building?
In terms of materials and all the rest of it, I don't know, there has to be. I mean, tall buildings are, by definition, they're more expensive. They're more expensive in all sorts of ways. They're more expensive to maintain and heat, for example, to keep the energy efficiency at 70 stories, at 70 metres, rather, you know, to maintain environmental conditions there is much more expensive than lower down, for example. But I don't know that, you know, it all depends upon the circumstances. As I said earlier, you know, the tall buildings that in Kennington, which were refurbished, suddenly people wanted to live in them, and they wanted to get out of them before, when they were, you know, there wasn't any concierge. But the question you asked, I think about people. Tell me if I'm wrong. About people's perception of them outside. Like, how can we get people to
support them? Yeah.
Exactly, support them. Yeah, and I've got a lot of anecdotal evidence of the lack of support of tall buildings and the support for mid-rise. And a classic example is one we had in Lambeth Walk, where the council wanted to build on some sheltered housing, 2-storey sheltered housing, therefore, you know, intensify. This is in the CAS. But they wanted to put a 14-storey building next to a open space and causing shadowing and all the rest of it. We got architects to produce an alternative, which was going to be 6 stories, was going to reuse the existing buildings and add floors onto them and then create one new building that was 6 stories tall. And we're going to have the same number of units, 145 units, will come out at the end of it. I was actually going to provide you a picture, and I'll send you a picture of the two, because one brought 500 objections and the other was the community supported, and this is experienced all the time at the moment. There's an inquiry about to open in Peckham for some huge buildings in the Aylsham. Were they lower if they had real affordable housing, they've got a minuscule amount of 12% affordable housing, then they would be. There wouldn't be this campaign. These campaigns take off because, to start with, and it was the case with Aylsham, it's the case now with Truman Brewery and Brick Lane, where there's an inquiry going on right now. What triggers people is these outlandishly, these buildings that don't fit in with the context in any way, in any shape or form. They're completely out of context. You know, suddenly sticking 14 stories in Streatham Vale, so 14 stories in lots of parts of Waterloo, we would welcome. But 14 stories in Streatham Vale is completely outlandish, and so the whole community takes up arms and fights it. And it clearly is a middle way, and as I explained, the mid-rise example we had in Denby Court, we haven't managed to get an architect to do this for free. He came up with a full scheme. It's fantastic. The council wouldn't hear it. They wouldn't listen to it. They closed their eyes to it, unfortunately. And we've got into this YIMBY, NIMBY, yes, no stuff. We need to get out of that, get out of being locked into that. And mid-rise is surely the way to go.
Sharia, am I pronouncing that correctly? Sharia. So what's your take on why people would support or would oppose mid-rise? I'm a bit of a fan. I think even in suburban places where you have a mid-rise block on the end of the road, on the corner plot, I think it makes sense, a bit more density to that road. It's not too offensive to the sort of curtilage, as it were. But do other people feel that way? What's been your experience of people's ability to support it or not, or willingness, rather?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think there's lots of different factors going on here. So if you look at people's preferences on housing, I think people's revealed preferences that they like to live in areas where lots of other people live. So in areas of high density, the rents are higher, the house prices are higher, there's more demand for housing. But when you look at people's preferences on what they want for themselves or new housing in their very local area, I think a 2021 study in London found that people preferred lower density as a new development that was being proposed in their area. And of course, you know, we've discussed people's preference for accessible outdoor space, which is much easier to achieve with lower or low mid-rise development. So there's different factors going on here. Then, of course, as we've already heard, something that influences people's preferences over new housing is things like, is there new infrastructure? Is there adequate funding for public services? Is there a decent proportion of affordable housing in the new development? And those are all easier to fund if there's a higher level of density and so a larger amount of land value uplift to extract from the development. So there, I think policymakers have to weigh up all these different considerations. And then, of course, there's the impact of the new housing on affordability. And we know that the more new housing we deliver, the bigger the impact that will have on affordability and the ability for families in the area to stay in the area and to access affordable housing.
Do you think people are aware of that and know that when they're being questioned about housing?
Do you mean members of the public?
Yeah, because, you know, it's our butter and bread. We know that supply is the issue, blah, blah, blah. But do you think your average Londoner is sitting around thinking, well, if they built in Kennington, it would help me down here in Kensington? Are they thinking that?
I think there was some research, I think it was in America, that found that people didn't have a strong sense of that supply effect. They did for other markets, but not for housing. But then if you look at polling, for example, YouGov asked Londoners what their views were on building more housing, and I think 72% of Londoners said they were pro-building more housing. So I think it depends what you look at. On some polling evidence, there is strong suggestion that people want new housing. They do think that will help make housing more affordable and more accessible.
I suppose we speak about all the time in London, don't we? And to our online guest, you talked about the success of mid-rise in places like Glasgow because they're traditionally there. But do you have any examples where new rise buildings have been built and people are in support of them and they've been viewed as successful?
Again, I'm going to kind of go back to the Scandinavian examples here as well. If you look at some of the new redevelopments that have happened in Stockholm, there's an area called Hammarby, which is probably incorrectly pronounced, but it's kind of a post-industrial port area. where it's predominantly medium rise, and it's a sustainable development. It's mixed use. They're, making sure that it's connected in terms of public transport. They're encouraging minimum car use. They have, really sustainable waste and water management systems. It's worth a look in Stockholm. And then there's another example in Nordhavn, which is 4 kilometres outside of the city centre in Copenhagen as well. And again, Scandinavia, they live at medium density and have been for a very long time, so they know how to do it very well. And again, they're creating this 5-minute city in Nordhavn is what they're discussing. So it has all of those public services, all the amenities that people need, but not within the 15-20-minute city that we have heard discussed about quite a lot over recent years, but really within 5 minutes travel time from this new development. And again, it's a mixed use, it's a redevelopment. I think there's opportunities to be able to create medium rise and mid-rise housing on a lot of sites in London where it could be gentle densification or densification, it could be infill. There's a lot of really well connected places across London where there are opportunities for adding and increasing density, but doing it in a relatively discreet way. And again, providing that kind of proof of concept that we can live at medium level density quite effectively. And often if it's not coming into the local areas in a kind of very bullish way, in the way that we see high density developments. And again, just to add to the examples from earlier, the discussions in Brixton around the development of the Hondo Tower and what happened there. And there was so much pushback from the local community because that development was entirely out of context. I think that if you can really work within the local context and provide clear evidence that this type of housing works, then you're on the right path to being able to deliver more of it across the city more broadly.
Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Garbutt.
Thank you. Just to come back on the discussion that was just being had, Shreya, what evidence have you got around that more housing that's built, so from London, that more housing is built makes it more affordable and that families can stay here?
Yeah, of course, sorry. Just
No,
give me a second.
So for places like Dalston, for example, that have been overdeveloped, they've closed primary schools. So, yeah.
Can I just quickly, so that's the reason, that's not the reason that schools have closed down in London, as we well know. It's not because of a lack of development. It's because of housing costs and a falling birth
I think,
rate
I'll ask for Shreya to come in with the
I
evidence.
just don't want us to be characterising our personal views as and posing them as facts to
Okay, so I'd just like to hear from Shreya, yeah.
Yeah, of course. So I think there was a recent GLA report which looked at a bunch of different evidence in London and elsewhere which linked new housing supply to lower housing costs relative to what would have happened otherwise. So they looked at a number of examples demonstrating that even new housing at the top of the market had effects further down the chain, so for more affordable housing and for poorer families. And then I think there's a number of examples I can point to in other parts of the world as well. So, for example, in Auckland, which passed some reforms in 2016 to make it easier to build housing, they found that rents were up to 35% lower than they would have been. Or
Yeah,
they were
there's a specific, the London ones I was interested in. But we can pick that, we can pick that up through the investigation. I was going to come to you on stronger voices for people in shaping the areas as they grow. I think, do you want to have some space to talk about tools like the street votes and local ballots and whether they are realistic and whether they work? Because I know there's some criticism of them, but it'd be good to hear your views.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's worth noting that research suggests that the current planning system isn't wholly representative in how it engages the public. It tends to favour older residents, more likely to be homeowners, more likely to be wealthy, people who are time rich, who aren't necessarily working full time or having caring responsibilities because they have more time to engage with long community meetings. So I think it's worth thinking about how we can involve a wider section of the community. As I mentioned, I think there is broad popular support for house building, so it's important that we're not listening to a small minority who engage quite loudly with the process. I think things like street votes are a useful way of doing that because it allows us to take a targeted approach area by area, and areas which are particularly don't feel that densifying is right for them, we can allow them to opt out or to not engage, but then areas which feel that they would benefit from having that more density and letting homeowners expand their homes or add new units on top of their homes, we can allow them to pursue that. So it's that kind of micro-democracy that I think bypasses that potentially sometimes anti-democratic element that we see in our current planning system. And then I think, in terms of examples, we might look at places around the world. So Houston in 1998 passed legislation, not the same as street votes, but that allowed that reformed planning, but allowed areas to opt out if there was a high enough demand to opt out, and that allowed the reforms to deliver lots of new housing, make the city more affordable, and was politically stable. And then in Tel Aviv as well, in the 90s and early noughties, similar reforms allowed densification, but allowed areas to opt in and out as they wish to. And that, again, delivered a more politically stable way of moving towards densification in the areas where people felt it was most appropriate.
Yeah, we've heard a lot in the first panel about that change in that democracy and the way that people were able to give their views and kind of shape their local area. So some of the criticism, so in terms of street votes, I just wondered what you see as the kind of biggest barrier, and if they are kind of realistic in a London context.
Yeah, and I think we're really hopeful that we'll see pilots, and that will able us to take a better view of how realistic they'll be. I think there are definitely questions around how they'll work in practice, and whether the evidentiary requirements for residents will present a high barrier to take up. Whether people will engage in the process. But I think definitely. Like looking at these other reforms, other examples where similar reforms have worked successfully, our hope is that here as well there'll be engagement, there'll be interest from people who want to bring that to their own neighbourhoods and who feel that adding more density would benefit them and their community. And so, I think the hope is that there will be good take-up.
Great, thank you for that more detail. Michael, did you want to come in on any of those aspects?
Yeah, a few points. One, on that very first bit about prices coming down. The OBR report last year said that if the government achieves 1.5 million homes, prices will come down 0.8%. It's completely ineffective as a mechanism to bring prices down. That is not. Now, the real point isn't whether we agree or disagree. It's that actually this is the lived experience of people in London. They're experiencing development coming in their area and prices going up. New homes coming and prices going up. So, and so that's there's an issue of legitimacy there. So, I'm seeing, which I wasn't seeing 20 years ago. I started doing this 30 years ago, and the proportion of affordable housing requirement came in 1998, and that issue, it was sort of accepted. Okay, we'll get some private housing, we'll get some affordable housing, and we'll get this balance. But it's now. That if something comes in with completely affordable housing, essentially it's affordable housing, there is enormous support for it. So there's an issue of legitimacy there that grates and is a problem. So then on the issue of street votes, I don't quite understand really, because London isn't streets, it's neighbourhoods. And neighbourhood forums, they have votes, they have elections. You have to have an election to have a neighbourhood forum. You have to have a neighbourhood plan. It has to go to an election and has to get a certain percentage of people to vote for it, etc. And that's all good. And I have very good experiences of that. We have lots of good experiences of that. The really good experience, though, is when the community are really involved. They're really co-producing. They're really involved in the production of the plan and what should happen. And even if they've got some stake of ownership of the land. And a great example is Coin Street, and an example actually of, and I should have given it earlier, of a mid-rise, great place for families. It's 55, a Roco house behind the National Theatre, 55 family homes in a 5-storey block that goes around in a U with a playground area in the middle. It's fabulous, and was very supported and came through a process of community engagement and community owning the land via Coin Street. But even Shell, they've done an enormous scheme, which you must have seen if you go near the eye, where they've got 800 flats on that, and these are tall buildings. They're not mid-rise at all. They got a very mixed reception. They didn't get huge opposition, which is extraordinary because it was a really tough proposal, and that's because they had a really good consultation process. For a year, they hired a company called Soundings, and they had weekly, monthly, lots and lots of consultation, lots and lots of engagement, and people came to the point of saying, well, okay, I can see that in this really high density area, we'll accept these towers. They're coming in with 800 homes. There was 20% affordable housing. There was a whole load of social housing was built off-site. These were all benefits. It was interesting to see that, and they then built it. It's now built. It's very quick. We've got sites in Waterloo that have been haggling for 40 years, have been vacant, and this is the case all over the city, all over London. Sites where developers keep flipping and they want more, and et cetera, et cetera. If there's real consultation and they genuinely came across as they wanted to do this, and they obviously did, because they did it. They built it. By the way, the key person who was the liaison with the community was your deputy mayor for business.
Just to ask a quick follow-up and then bring in Nicola. I just wondered if you could speak to balancing the interests and opinions of current residents versus Londoners still in need of homes, if you have any thoughts on the balance of interests and opinions of current residents with those of Londoners who still need homes. If you can speak to how we balance those two needs, and then I'm going to go to Nicola.
You shouldn't have to balance them. Surely they should coalesce. I do not know. I've never been in any experience where a community opposes affordable housing, in particular, social housing, affordable housing of any kind. I know I've written hundreds, thousands of objection letters. I've done lots of campaigns. We've never opposed affordable housing, social housing. So that is not now. That we go back to the issue of building private housing, and I go back to that point that 30 years ago there wasn't an objection to it. We wanted more housing. We wanted more housing in Waterloo. We got 3,000 homes in Waterloo. 95% of them were not affordable, and now there isn't a desire for any more. We don't want any more homes. We want affordable homes. We don't want just ordinary homes. We don't want market homes. We want affordable homes. So that is a big issue.
Thank you. Nicola, I'll come to you, and I know Sherelle wants to come in. And then Hannah.
Thank you. Just one point in terms of the impact of the additional supply in local areas and what that does to prices. It is very locally contextual, and it's very, very difficult to actually ascertain in terms of if you do this and you build X number of houses, then Y will happen in terms of a price or a rental impact on a local market. Because all the various factors, I mean, there's myriad different influences on these things are quite difficult to measure. And it's more of a kind of correlation versus causation overall. But I think whenever we think about the fact that, yes, the supply is necessary, we need more houses everywhere, really, when we think about London. We need the right types of housing in the right place. And I think, people are not going to oppose, the growth of affordability and, more social homes across the board in the majority of cases. But they may be more exercised about that high-rise versus medium-rise discussion that we had earlier on. And I think the street votes is a really interesting, potentially very innovative way to give local residents a bit more active ownership and, influence over what happens in their local areas. And I think if that's going to be done, it'll be interesting to see how this rolls out and through the pilots and the various different ways in which it'll be explored in a bit more detail, because it's ensuring that everything is done within integrity within that particular area, however it's defined. Is it a street? Is it a neighbourhood? Is it a collective of streets? And what kind of spaces are they working with in terms of creating new homes? And thinking about that gentle, softer infill densification and opportunities within those particular areas, and how you do it in a way that ensures that there's no kind of undue influence from anybody in particular, or that it's done in a kind of a managed and appropriate way in order to make sure that it is done legitimacy or in a legitimate way in line with policy. But I think from an engagement perspective and that co-production of space and the opportunities of actually really bringing people into the decision making, it could be a very positive way of creating better and new homes for people.
Thank you. Freya, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to come in on a few points we've just been discussing. I mean, on the point about whether adding more supply affects affordability, I mean, just to sort of reiterate again, the GLA's own research suggests that you know, there's a large amount of evidence that it does, looking both at London and elsewhere. I think, you know, the government's own analysis suggests that the recent reforms of the government to increase housing supply will have a big effect on growth and affordability. So I think there's a large degree of consensus on that among economists and policy analysts. I think on the point about London's lived experience, I would just say I don't think we're not building enough at the moment. The Centre for Cities estimates that we have nationally a 4 million homes backlog, and that's just to bring us to the level of the rest of Europe, which obviously has its own problems with housing. So I would just stress that. And then, on the point about whether people oppose social housing, I would just say that in Islington, where I'm a councillor, we do have examples of developments, for example, the Holloway Prison development, which is delivering 60% genuinely affordable housing. That has attracted opposition from some corners. So I would say it's not always the case that people will support a development that delivers large amounts of affordable housing.
So just to kind of come back to your question, which was about kind of involving the public, which is finally the area that I can speak to. As Shreya sort of mentioned, it's really a small minority, right, that get involved in planning right now. Our polling showed 11% of Londoners said that they had commented on a planning application in the past year. 51% of people, Londoners specifically, said they don't know how to take part in consultations about developments in their local areas. There's this massive knowledge gap. You know, people, we're talking about mid-rise housing here, you know, see me as the voice of the public. Mid-rise housing is not something people are talking about, right? But it's not, people aren't talking about actually housing very much at all. People who are doing so very loudly. That's kind of what's happening here. And so in the way that we involve the public, therefore, has to be, as Shreya alluded to, informative. We can't assume that people have the knowledge they need already, because they don't. And those that do, we're already hearing from. The vast majority, we're not hearing from because, you know, they don't think about planning on a day-to-day basis or house building or know much about it. As I just spoke to, they don't even know how they would take part if they did have something to say on this topic. You know, when it comes to the question of house building people's local areas, it does get a bit more tangible. So, you know, if you say, you know, not to bring up the backyard thing again, but, you know, if you say something's going to get built in your backyard, that does feel tangible to people, and people often are a bit more able to speak to that. But what that does is puts people in a place, so the way that I'd say the kind of planning consultation system is set up right now, puts people in a place where they're thinking about their own interests, their current self, not future residents, as you spoke about, their backyard, you know, how will this impact me? That's why I think there really are limits to talking about, you know, even polling, which you know, is helpful in many ways. But if you really want to understand people's attitudes in a way that I think is constructive for policy making, it's all about doing so much more kind of meaningfully and more in depth, more considered, more informed. So the kind of principles that we got to in terms of planning, at least, is that the participation should be early and representative, and it should be participatory, not just consultatory. And so early meaning not once the kind of plan is already developed or the kind of, you know, only at the kind of planning application stage. earlier on, at the, for example, strategic planning level, getting people involved in like what is the vision for your area? How can we balance all the different needs of current and future residents, of, transport and housing and, infrastructure and all of these questions. Representative, obviously, as I mentioned, we are really hearing from a minority. As you alluded to, it is often kind of, our polling backs us up, homeowners, older people, people who generally own housing now rather than future residents. So representation is really important, in part because it's going to help you get people who support house building, right? So it's also kind of a practical need as well as a kind of moral imperative. And then participation rather than consultation, so people are genuinely able to kind of have a say, rather than just kind of, for example, in a planning application, kind of a yes/no answer. It's more of a kind of considered, informed process, and they're given the information they need, access to kind of experts, potentially working with policymakers. So yeah, those are just a few of our kind of principles.
Thank you. I think Michael wants to come back in, but I might go to the next question because it's still on this kind of theme. So, shall I? Yeah.
Assemblymember Lord Bailey and then Assemblymember Baker.
Thank you, and I think your last intervention was quite good. I just want to say something, ask Michael a question. You said that you've never personally been involved in people opposing social housing, and Hannah made the point about the usual suspects, the retired, the wealthy, the people at home. But I'd add to the group of usual suspects is people who are seeking social housing. Everybody around this table spent years arguing on behalf of those people. The point I pick out your comment, Michael, is because most of the people in London who have housing need are not eligible for social housing. So who's arguing on their part is important. How would we include them in the conversation? In the earlier session, I brought up the point about the future resident. So a lot of housing that's been developed are for people who don't exist yet. So how do we make sure they're involved in the conversation? Because residents, imperfect as it may be, do have a voice, at least in the planning planning procedures as they stand. And I'm becoming more and more worried about a very large group of people from different walks of life, people in temporary accommodation, people who do just earn a little bit too much to be eligible for social housing. How do they have a voice in these conversations about what type of housing, topology, and residency, how do we get their voices into that conversation?
Well, one of the things is we've got to get away from there's a lot of focus on responding to a planning application. Mm-hmm. And the issue actually really is getting people involved in, as you just said, the strategic plan. Right. And getting a wide conversation with a lot of information, a long process. I mean, I described the one that Shell did with soundings, but essentially that model, it was interesting how people they were drawn in and people got really interested in engaging. And you're thinking about the whole thing. You're not just thinking about my backyard, you're not just thinking about what my view is, you're thinking about the whole context. And everybody wants a good park, a good school, a good shopping centre, a good rail connection. They want all those things. Working together, you can get a plan together. A real problem with our system is that it's all so discretionary. The decision making is so discretionary. So people feel like disheartened when they get a plan and they say, wow, we've got this great plan, and then actually decisions are taken very differently against the plan. The planning applications are determined quite differently. And this isn't a complaint against decision makers, it's the reality of the very discretionary process we have as a planning process. And I'm not suggesting we should be going full zonal and, just you have to stick to these things, but there is a problem here, and that is a real problem. I've done a lot of stuff where I've gone out to groups like youth clubs, and they're the people who are like our next generation, and they're always really interested. They know nothing about it, and they get really interested because they realise. Often what I say to them is, is it actually often isn't necessarily very good with younger people. It's like a garden. A city is like a garden. It has to be tended. It grows. It changes. It has to be tended. I took a person across London on a bus who was an older person, who was, in other ways, very thoughtful. She had no idea of this. She just thought the city just was the city. He said, what's happened to that? And what's this? What's going on over there? And I explained. And she was like, oh, right, so this actually needs to be nurtured. It needs to be cultured. It needs to be cultivated. Our town centre needs to be cultivated. Instead, we end up in this stupid situation like was referred to earlier, the Hondo Tower in Brixton. You're against it, you're for it, you don't want it. You end up in that situation rather than let's plan an area, let's agree as a neighbourhood. And that's certainly the case in neighbourhood forums that I've been involved in and we've seen. Good neighbourhood forums, I mean, there might be bad ones, but I've never seen a bad one. Good neighbourhood forums that bring in people from all walks. They have to look across their demography against what, have they got the range of people that are in this area? Are they involved in this? And they're open doors, and they devise a plan, and they spend, often it takes several years to devise this plan. The heartache is when it comes to nothing because of the discretionary process, and we've got to fix that.
Okay, Chair, just I think when we look at we talked in our pre-meet about looking at new cities. One of the things we should look at is how does the mayor do this strategic level planning for that whole new area. So this is a real opportunity to take on this level of planning, so people are not opposing every building in there, they're supporting the development of the entire new city.
Definitely, it's emerging as a big theme within this investigation. Assemblymember Bacon.
Thanks, Chair. I just want to wrap up. We've already touched a lot on the consultation process, current consultation process and system. So just want to wrap that up. Just want to ask whether there's anything specific around the nature of mid-rise and that sort of gentle, to nick the previous panel's gentle increase in density that you'd like to comment on about how we do planning consultations, and if there are any new approaches, I think we've touched upon this a bit, new approaches or best practice in terms of digital or creative or local that improves the quality of engagement. Does that make sense? Just a couple of things that I don't think we've quite touched upon in our consultation, discussion and consultations. Michael.
Yes. There are some obvious things, and community review panels are theoretically. I mean, they have only been going for a short while, but they look like a very interesting approach, and they seem to be the right approach rather than simply design review panels where designers come in and look at it rather than the context of a community. Citizens' assemblies, these are normal things that we really should try out much more. But I want to emphasise the challenge that we got and the context. There's a very different challenge in outer London from inner London. There's a very different set of issues. I mean, for example, the transport issue is such an important issue for outer London. So many parts of outer London are disconnected, or they're only connected in one route and there's no orbital and all the rest of it, So for them, mid-rise is a challenge, whereas for lots of people in inner London, I think that mid-rise would be welcome because they're unhappy with seeing the high-rises that they feel excluded from. Mid-rise would be a good thing. I have one other. Sorry, I'm just thinking about. No, and the other thing, and I have to say, it's a bit like the discretionary planning system. It's something maybe we can't do anything about, but politics has got a bit weird in that my local councillor is being threatened with being stood down by the party because she's too close to the community. What's going on? This is crazy. And 30 years ago, when I first started doing this, the local councillors were so much more aware and involved in planning and representing, listening to people, helping them in understanding it and leading these issues, and we've got so much more centralised and incapable of doing that. I just see that happening. I have my experience of that happening, and I think that's a real problem. And people, they fill that vacuum. The usual suspects fill that vacuum, and it's important that we get away from that. And I go back to the plan making is the way to get away from that.
Thanks very much, Hannah. Do you have anything to contribute?
Yeah, so I think when we're thinking about, what methods to use, it also depends on kind of the question that we're asking. So, we were looking specifically at strategic planning level, but, it will apply to kind of other plan making. you know, if you want to use digital methods, of which there are, you know, many increasingly kind of famous examples of this, I think those can be great for trying to get at-scale engagement, so as many people to take part as possible. But because it's sort of like, you know, commenting on a planning application, because it's sort of just there and there's, you know, like a question, you're not really taken through a process, you're not informed about something. I think it's much better for a kind of high-level question, vision setting, for example, you know, what's your vision for your area in the next 10 to 15 years? Just to give an example, though, so a few examples, if helpful, of digital kind of engagement methods. I'm not sure if you've come across Polis, which is been used a lot in the kind of digital democracy space, and there are sort of similar models that are coming up of this, but basically the idea of Polis is about gathering consensus. So people are asked to kind of input a statement in response to a question, and they can vote, agree or disagree, and pass something like that kind of on everyone else's statement. So they see all the statements of other residents, and what happens is at the end of it, you get kind of the statements that generate the most consensus. So it's a sort of slightly different way of doing it. It's about people actually feel like they've engaged in a process because they've kind of looked at other people's answers and you know, kind of voted and taken part and maybe added more statements as they go on. And so it sort of feels more participatory, but also you come up with kind of consensus rather than division. There's also been experimentation in terms of like gamification. So the San Francisco Bay Area they created a game version of kind of a planning engagement called the Mayor of Bayville. And 3,000 kind of residents took part, and through that they kind of they found out that kind of transport links was something that was really important to people. So it kind of actually worked in getting something serious, despite kind of being kind of a gamified version, and was really good in terms of getting young people to take part, and you know, not the usual suspects basically. And then in terms of when you want to ask a more in-depth question, so you know, for example, making people consider trade-offs around like housing and planning and, you know, tricky things. You know, you want to do something, I would argue, deliberative. So citizens' assembly, citizens' panels, those sorts of things. There's an example in Toronto. They had a planning review panel, and it was 32 members, sort of broadly representative group. They met approximately once a month for 2 years, and they were closely involved with the kind of planning committee or the sort of, the Toronto City Planning Division. And they kind of, sort of worked with them, kind of more of a co-design kind of strategy, which works really well because it means that you know, people are inputting in a way that's genuinely helpful for policymakers. Policymakers can help steer the conversation, set the parameters and say, oh, actually, this isn't, you know, within our control, or this isn't one part of the question. Let's, you know, focus on this, and not in a kind of negative way. And like, let's actually only talk about the things you can genuinely impact, and then that makes it more likely people will have an impact. And sort of one of the key reasons why we care about this stuff is because that increases people's trust in sort of government and various authorities, which, as I'm sure you know, is very low. So yes, that's sort of what I'd say in terms of approaches. And I just want to quickly add on the future residents some thinking, which is, I think it's really hard, right? Because you don't know who the future residents are. I think if you have a kind of broadly representative group involved, you can hope to kind of cover more likely kind of the future resident type people than you would otherwise, than you do currently. Also, if you look at a bigger scale, so, you know, going back to sort of strategic planning, you're also more likely to kind of involve future residents of various specific areas, right, in a kind of big picture way. And then there's also some interesting ways of getting people who are involved in a kind of participatory or deliberative process to think about future residents. So there's a technique called future design thinking that I believe has come out of Japan. And it's all about people like role-playing and getting in the shoes of future residents and like going beyond like their current situation, their current circumstance. There's also like really interesting ways of getting people to think in a different and more way that's focused on the common good, really, which is kind of what deliberation is really good at doing, all about.
Thank you. Shreya, do you have anything to
Yeah,
add?
of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe just reiterating some of the points we've already discussed. Obviously, mid-rise, lots of areas that are considered traditionally like beautiful, popular, historical areas. The blocks in Paris, parts of London, central London, that have beautiful terraced housing are all examples of mid-rise housing that I think are incredibly popular.
Yeah, they really need to focus on the consultation. We're running out of time, basically. So if we focus on consultation, specific aspects of it at mid-rise, or any new ways of doing consultation that may assist. That's the question.
Sure. No, I guess I would just say again, it's important to be mindful of inclusion, not rely on people having lots of time to engage in a process. Digital is good for engaging a wider range of people. There's huge support for new housing, and part of that is just, these people have been elected, and they can. That is a way of the community engaging in the process as well. So just reflecting that.
Okay, thanks. Nicola, did you have anything to add?
I will just be very quick and just
Thanks.
reinforce the fact that I think that there are a lot of different opportunities in the way that we use things like social media, the way that we use digital platforms, the way that we use QR codes that could potentially be operationalised at the different levels of the system and the strategic planning approach that Hannah discussed. Whether or not you want something more broad and consensus-based, or whether or not you want something more granular and specific. I think that that's potentially a way to be able to actually get more information out to the more underrepresented in the community, because actively we're all using and we're all engaging with tech and social media on a daily basis. So maybe there's a way to kind of integrate this sort of fact-finding and the consultation process into that moving forward and thinking about those future residents.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you. Assemblymember Moama.
Okay, so I think the first part of my question has been covered. It was about international communities where mid-rise development has been embraced. I did want to just touch on the exchange between Michael and Assemblymember Lord Bailey about whose voices are heard in the current system of how we consult, because I think it applies to mid-rise, but it also applies to just the system as a whole. I wholeheartedly agree with you that if there is a strategic objective around social or affordable housing and a planning application comes forward for that, there should be censure for those people that vote against it. I agree with you on that. But I think that one of the issues around the current system and some of the proposals that the panel have put forward, which individually are really good, but collectively there's always the risk of the same people put themselves forward for the Citizens' Assembly or the Citizens' Panel, or take part in that consultation because people are being asked to volunteer rather than... So they're self-selecting is what I'm saying, and there's no shade to those people that do that. It's very, very valuable. But those people who... I wonder if we can maybe try and flip it on its head so that when I've worked a very long time ago on estate regenerations, we did all of those things we talked about. So spend 6 months on site, and either knock on doors or let people just drop in for a cup of tea and just not give them opinion, but just give them fact about what was being presented, and they shared their opinion, which led to a stronger decision that more people were, if not happy with the outcome, then at least they knew that they were part of the process and they hadn't had the wool pulled over their eyes in that process. So I just wonder how we can flip it so that we can have more people actually engaged in the process rather than having lots of different bodies where the same people show up to each thing. Should we start with maybe Hannah?
Yes, so with approaches like citizens' panels, citizens' assemblies, the idea is to avoid self-selection as much as possible. So, it depends what method of kind of recruitment you have. It's not kind of a volunteer basis exactly. So sort of the gold standard method, which is the most expensive because it's gold standard, is a sortition process. So, you send out lots and lots of letters to randomly selected number of households, like thousands and thousands from like the register of postcodes that you have, and invite them to take part. And so there is a self-selecting element, of course, because people will read about this thing and kind of they will have to say, yes, I would like to take part. But given the scale of people you're going out to, it's far less self-selecting than the current system, right? Because you're actually genuinely going out to a random selection of households. And then what happens is there's a sort of stratification process. So people who say, yes, I'd like to take part, then you have some sort of criteria for how you're going to reach a broadly representative sample, and so you accept or reject people on that basis, and then from that, those hundreds, say, of letters you get back, you choose a sample. And so, yes, there is an element of self-selection, but far, far less than otherwise. Another method that's used, which is far more cost-effective, but less genuinely random, is using market research recruitment methods. There's a big network of market research recruiters across the country who use a variety of methods, maybe going out to their social media networks, maybe they have databases of people, maybe they use door knocking, kind of snowballing methods, lots of different methods depending on the recruiter. But they will basically go out and kind of they'll be paid to find people kind of to take part. And the key thing that is that gets you the different people, the less kind of usual suspects, is that the incentive to take part for them is not because they know about the issue or care or have views on it already. It's they're being paid to take part. So incentivization, financial incentives are key to kind of the inclusion question. And so that's how you genuinely do get people who have never taken part in kind of a consultation before taking part in these processes. You can also set criteria around that. You can say, I'm only going to take people who have never commented on a planning application. There are ways as well that you can do that. So it's less just like taking any volunteers. There's actually like a really specific kind of criterion and recruitment rather than like letting people reach out to you, if that makes sense.
Thank you. I'm going to come to you, Michael, last, if that's okay, because you raised the issue in the first place in that exchange. But if I go to Shreya and then to Nicola and then Michael.
Yeah, thank you. So just on that question, I agree. And I think that's the point I've been trying to make about how making sure that engaging in the process is as efficient as possible so that you don't rely on people who have the time to engage, and that isn't inherently going to be a self-selecting group of people. As we've heard, there are things you can do to try and make it inclusive, and of course things like estate ballots are a good example of that and a way of engaging residents on estates and estate regeneration projects. And I think things like voting are a more time-efficient way of engaging with the process than things like engaging in a long process of meetings and deliberation. And that's why I think approaches like street votes are a good way of making sure that we're hearing from a broader section of society, getting more to targeted policy. And on the point about future residents, I think that's where national policy plays a role as well. Things like mandatory housing targets are a way for those residents who don't currently live in the area for their voices to be heard in the planning process to make sure that their needs are being considered along with the needs of local residents who already live there.
Thank you. Nicola?
I don't really have very much to add to this. I'm going to...
Okay, no, that's fine.
I really agree with everything that's been...
That's fine. And then Michael?
Yeah, it's a major conundrum of you've either got people who are very interested because they've got an interest, or they don't recognise they've got an interest and they're not interested, and it's a real problem. I mean, you get it. You're all politicians. You get it doing politics. You talk to people, and they just think it's not to do with them. They don't know. They don't know what they think. It's really difficult to get people to engage in a meaningful, constructive way. But I think the biggest thing that puts people off is the sense of this doesn't actually achieve anything. So it's really important to get outcomes that and often early, successful, visible outcomes of doing something. If you're doing a community master plan, an area, getting just a square sorted, getting £20,000 and sorting out something and showing this works. The other thing that really strikes me is schools. My kid at the moment is just doing geography A level, and they're talking about all this stuff all the time. They're living it. It's all around them, but they're looking at other places, and we should be recruiting our school children. We should be talking to those teachers and saying, You know, we've got all this stuff that's really interesting. You can use it for your education, and people can get involved and start understanding their role in the future. So I think schools are a really good way forward.
Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Very quickly.
Ms. Kapitanovich, the Council of Europe's definition of a citizens' assembly is random selection. You shouldn't, otherwise it's not a citizens' assembly. Would you agree with that?
So I think for citizens' assemblies, because they're generally bigger, well, they are bigger in scale, and therefore they're generally used for kind of bigger questions, and often run by national governments. They are held to a higher standard, I'd say, than some of the other methods. So, say a kind of citizens' jury type approach, which is the same principles as a citizens' assembly, but a smaller scale. So we're talking kind of like 20 to 30 rather than 100 people. And I think in practice, what's happened, what's happened in practice is that increasingly, I mean, loads of councils, for example, and I know the GLA have used similar methods. They're using these methods, and to make them cost effective, they've started going down the route of using kind of market research recruiters, and it's becoming kind of increasingly common practice, basically to make it a more kind of feasible, affordable process. And so, as I say, gold standard for sortition, but I do think it works like, you know, well enough, is cost effective to sort of go down the other route and legitimate. Perhaps not, though. You maybe don't want to take that risk for sort of such a big kind of thing as a citizens' assembly.
So we're going to have to move on.
I'll go on, yeah.
My question is to Shreya, and it's: do you think densification of low-rise homes to mid-rise would be desirable, particularly in outer London where dwellings per hectare are a lot lower? And then to open that up to the rest of the panel, how acceptable do you think that would be to those potentially living in the area or living in the homes that would be densified potentially in outer London?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that comes back to my point that, you know, adding more homes is good for affordability, raising living standards, allowing families to stay in the area, good for the environment. And the targets at the moment, I would say, they're not going to deliver all of that by themselves. We're going to need to do more than aim for the targets we've currently got if we want to make it affordable for young people to stay in London or to come and move to London to start families. So I absolutely think that mid-rise housing in London and densifying from low-rise to mid-rise is what we should be aiming for. And we've already got good policies to support that, but I think we need to do more, and that's where things like street votes or policies led by the local authority to encourage or, you know, require densification are really valuable.
Thank you. Yeah, and then just maybe we'll get Hannah first on the getting support for densifying low-rise areas into mid-rise.
So the only thing I'd say on this that's quite interesting from our polling is that going back to that question of kind of whether people support or oppose house building in their local area under a variety of scenarios, one of the statements or scenarios was that homes are only built in the most densely populated areas of your locality. And I'm not going to say that support is really high for this. So 39% of Londoners said they supported house building in their local area under that scenario. But it's interesting that it's a lot higher than the average around the country. I do think there are some indications from my polling which I think are interesting about the maybe it doesn't help you that much, but this sort of what's it called, the sort of situation is better in London in terms of people's attitudes to this, and they are more kind of accepting, I think, of these sorts of things.
Michael.
Yeah, I'm going to quote from Russell Curtis, actually. I saw something on his website. He says, land in London is precious, yet the suburbs have a hegemony over it. Those lucky enough to own a house in the suburbs, and in particular those living close to public transport, surely have a moral duty to allow more housing to be built around them so that others can benefit from convenient access to all of the amenities that the city has to offer. And I entirely agree with that, and I think many people would agree with it. The key issue is transport. It's absolutely essential. You get out of London, it's transport. If you've got a good transport node, and he's talking about he lives next to Barnet tube station, then, but you know, and you go out and it's all two-story, and you think, wow, you're right by a tube station. What's going on here? This is crazy. So, but how do we tackle that? We're in this is a unique situation. London is growing in a way that it has only grew in the 30s and in the end of the 19th century, but we've got 70% of the stock is over 100 years old. When we've grown before, we've just gone outwards. So in the Dickensian time, they just grew outwards. In the 30s, the metro land, they just grew outwards. We can't do that anymore. I mean, I know there's Greenbelt bits and new towns, but we've essentially got to rebuild the city. We've got to grow within our own area with the old stock. And the 2 up, 2 downs all across outer London are part of that. One of the things I was struck by, and it was in the first session you asked the question, I think, Sem, to the first group about how do we do this. And I immediately thought of my first place I rented, 90% improvement grant was given, this was in 1980, to a house in Brixton, the couple who had all these kids, and the kids had gone, they improved it, they turned it into a flat, they put the upstairs, but they needed money for it. They got the grant from the council, and the incentive of the council was that they got rent regulation, so it was rent controls. And rent controls are a big part of what we need. Not, how can we do that? This could be a real mechanism. It's actually incentivising financially those homes to go up. And I lived in one. I lived in a semi-detached where we could have easily gone into the roof, and we'd have loved to have gone into the roof. We didn't have the capital to do it, and we then could have lived on the rent, could have extorted from the rent of people renting it. So it's absolutely, we've got to find ways like that to do it.
Nicola, do you have anything to add?
Yep, absolutely. I think there are a lot of opportunities to do this and do this well when we think about what's happening in the outer reaches of London. If we think about places like Croydon, we have seen actually an increase in density in mid-rise housing in some ways through the permitted development rights and the conversion of a lot of older office space that is now being used as residential. Thankfully now they have to have natural light and they have to be of minimum space standards, but that's been a way where, housing that is coming onto the market that is of questionable quality, whereas I think we can do something now to take advantage of opportunities around creating places where people want to be, that are connected well by the transport links that Michael referred to, but doing it in a way where you're creating new communities and you're also providing incentives, so potentially subsidies, and thinking about shared ownership, thinking about ways in which we can bring in that missing middle maybe in terms of what people want from their housing careers, and give people more of a voice in terms of how they actually can have an influence on that process. If we think about the grey belt, we think about opportunities in new towns as well, but just thinking about the increase in density in this, low to medium rise, it's about using the infill sites as well. I mean, we've seen discussions around beds and sheds, and again, they can be done informally, which is unfortunate, but they can be done well too. So there's more discrete, smaller scale housing that can be created in that way that is lower rise still, but also we've got opportunities with mid-rise too. And I think there's a lot of redevelopment and retrofitting opportunities in terms of adding value to existing properties and extending units to make them into, from what is low rise, whether or not it's adding stories on top, whether or not it's extending, to make these more mid-rise, medium density kind of homes. We are going to need inherently more homes in London. It's an incontrovertible fact, and especially when we think about the sort of potential value for stranded assets across the UK and in London as well. There's a lot of housing that falls already below standard in terms of energy efficiency and EPCs and the like. I listened to a podcast recently where they talked about how there's about £2 trillion worth of housing stock that could become stranded assets. So it's about what we do with older housing, how we retrofit effectively, and how we create new housing at slightly different levels of density in a really positive way. But I think we definitely need to have broader conversations about incentives and subsidies and how that can work.
Thank you very much. A really quick question from Lord Bailey, and then we'll end with Assemblymember Garbutt.
Thank you, Chair. Michael, you made a comment about, you gave a quote from someone who said that people act, I think that person's entirely wrong, because those people bought those houses under certain circumstances. And for instance, they have to have a car. I have to have a car. I live in Romford. I don't want one. I have to. It's expensive. I also travel further to get into work, and I've made that sacrifice. I've had to pay for that sacrifice. The question I had for you, in order, because I believe that person is entirely wrong, because he's asking people to give up things. What's he going to give up in return for that, I'd ask. But how would you incentivise someone who lives in the suburbs of London to make that sacrifice, to build something, to have that change? Because that's... what you said, not on a personal level, is infuriating to me, because it suggests that everybody out in the suburbs is somehow greedily grabbed the land and that we owe it to the people inside of London. But what could you do to incentivise people to do that, to make that change?
That person was Russell Curtis on the first panel.
Okay,
that I was quoting.
So thank you for reminding me. He's wrong.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I take your point. But, there's a disagreement there. But the key point is to offer people better community stuff. A better town centre, a better shopping centre, better place to shop, better places. Obviously, the transport connections are critical. I mean, people who live along the Elizabeth line, their life has been transformed by the access to the Elizabeth line. The ability to get into central London in, nanoseconds. It's quite extraordinary. The counter side is that people in Southall are getting all these tall buildings, and we're wasting a real opportunity there. Where we've got a new Elizabeth line. We should be having lots of mid-rise. We could have high-density mid-rise development there, and instead we're getting ridiculous tall buildings. But I think the fundamental thing is to persuade people that where I live on the border with Croydon. I'm nowhere near a transport node. I'm 20 minutes. That's why I cycle everywhere. I'm 20 minutes away from the nearest, anything. But so I would like better transport. I'd like better shops. I'd like a school that's nearby, and those things come with densification. That's the key. That was the thing that I think many communities have learned this over the years.
We're going to have to move on. Assemblymember Garbutt.
Thanks. So this is just a final question. I know we're almost at time, and I know lots of this has come up already, but this is just about what role should the GLA and the Next London Plan play in promoting mid-rise housing? And I know lots of this has come up just around the planning process and some that Nicola was just saying. So maybe it's just a final quick comment from people, just anything that we need to kind of consider for the London Plan, and maybe you can send anything else in. So, Nicola, I might come to you first for a quick comment, and then the people in the room.
I think in terms of thinking about what changed in the last London Plan and the move away from the density matrix to the idea about optimal density, I think there could be a more strategic approach to what that might mean in relation to different levels of density, not necessarily putting, the cap on it with the maximum, which, in the end needed to change. We need something that can respond in a dynamic way, but do so in a way that does actually really highlight the potential benefits that come from the mid-rise aspects of housing density. I think that would be a good start. And again, maybe it's something that we've talked about, getting it out to people to think about things in a little bit more of a kind of integrated and engaged way. And maybe if it was actually highlighted as part of the plan as well, it would really sort of go into people's consciousness a little bit more in terms of the actors across all of the built environment, whether or not you're engaged with the planning process, to whether or not you're inherently involved in it because of your role as a planner or a developer or a councillor. I think getting that conversation into people's consciousness and thinking about how you do that effectively through the plan and through the idea of optimal density for high-rise, medium, low-rise could be a way of approaching it.
Thank you. Shreya, I'm going to come to you and then down the line just for last comments on the London Plan. Thanks.
Yeah, I think I would just say, but making sure that converting low-rise to mid-rise or allowing the building mid-rise is there as a baseline expectation. Like, we shouldn't be building low-rise or not letting people convert from low-rise to mid-rise. In London, it's so well connected and we have such a big need for housing. And I would just say also, making sure that we're rewarding councils that do the right thing and that they're sharing in some of the financial benefits that accrue to the whole community when we build more.
Great, thank you.
So really, for me, it's just involving the public kind of in an early representative way, as I've discussed. And just to say, in our report, the member majority, there's we set out in way more detail kind of how we think soon to be strategic authorities, so including the GLA, should engage people in the development of their spatial development strategies, such as the London Plan.
Great, thank you. And Michael, last comments on the London Plan.
Firstly, we need to get a definition of mid-rise in the London plan, and we need a policy on it. There's a policy on tall buildings. It runs to 8 to 10 pages. We need something similar for. We need something more than something similar, because actually we need to take away the priority from tall buildings and focus it on mid-rise, and that's what the London plan should be. The next London plan should be doing. We also need guidance in, beyond the strategic plan itself, but more detailed guidance, like the characterisation, which is a great LPG, but it fails on that issue. And the one area I think we could really use it on is opportunity area planning frameworks. And they're also an area where consultation has been abysmal. And where it has been good, then it's actually had really good outcomes. But in most of the time, it's been abysmal. So the consultation of Vauxhall was 0. There was one meeting, and we've got a basket case of an area as a result. So we need to do a lot more on that. And mid-rise, APF, opportunity areas, not just focusing on high-rise, but focusing on mid-rise. And also, finally, on the density matrix, absolutely, we need to bring back the density matrix. It needs to be dynamic in the way that was said earlier, but losing that was a disaster.
Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you all very much. We've now reached the end of the session. I would like to thank all our guests for your contributions today. The committee has a few more brief items of business to deal with. Nicola, you're welcome to leave the virtual meeting or remain online as we go through the remaining items of business, and I kindly ask our guests in the chamber to remain seated for a moment. It won't take very long. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion?
Noted.
We also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the discussion.
Agreed.
Can I ask the committee to note the work programme for the 25-26 Assembly year?
Noted.
The next meeting of the Planning and Regeneration Committee will take place on 27th of November 2025 at 10 a.m. in the Chamber, City Hall. I have no urgent business which concludes today's meeting.